Click the subscribe button above so you don't miss a single wild Western action adventure. Let's saddle up for night canyons. Chapter 1. Between high blood-red canyon walls, the trail ran swirling, crossing and crossing again a noisy little creek. The water sparkled as it danced over smooth stones, its sound echoing off the towering cliffs. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and damp earth. Along the road, two chunky gray horses were pulling a covered Studebaker wagon, its wooden wheels creaking softly against the rocky path. A tarp, patched in variegated shades of brown and green, stretched over its bows, fluttering slightly in the breeze. The wagon looked well-worn but sturdy, a testament to many miles traveled. Driving was a gray-mustached, pleasant-faced rancher, puffing contentedly on a pipe. His weathered hands held the reins with practiced ease, and his eyes crinkled at the corners as he gazed at the familiar landscape. The smoke from his pipe curled upward, blending with the faint mist rising from the creek. Following the wagon came 6 loose saddle horses, hazed along by a pretty dark-eyed girl sitting a blood-bay gelding with a careless, thistle-like grace. Her movements were fluid, almost effortless, as she guided the horses with subtle shifts of her weight and gentle nudges of her heels. The gelding's coat gleamed in the sunlight, a deep, rich red that contrasted sharply with the muted tones of the canyon. Dressed in gray breeches, a woolen shirt, and a flat-crowned sombrero, she looked to be a youngster of 15 or 16, but Laura Carvel was past 18. Her attire was practical, yet carried a touch of elegance, the sombrero shading her face from the sun while allowing her dark eyes to shine with determination. Her posture was confident, her expression calm but alert, as though she were ready for whatever the trail might bring. As the wagon and the horses passed through the sun and shadow of the canyon, she began whistling a gay, somewhat intricate tune which her father, the driver, had often played on what their rancher neighbors called a fiddle, in reality an expensive violin. The melody floated through the air, mingling with the sounds of the creek and the occasional snort of the horses. It was a tune that spoke of home and memories, a reminder of simpler times. In the wagon, Dale Carvel, nodding in time with the whistled music, suddenly hauled back on the reins. His expression shifted from contentment to alertness as he scanned the trail ahead. The horses slowed, their ears twitching as they sensed the change in their driver's demeanor. Making a sharp turn about a cliff shaped like a boat's prow, the team had run into half a dozen horsemen, drawn up in a line. The riders were motionless, their silhouettes stark against the bright sky. The tension in the air was palpable, a silent challenge hanging between the two groups. A battle line, plainly, for 4 of the riders held rifles above their saddle horns. The weapons gleamed dully in the sunlight, their presence a clear warning. The riders' faces were hard, their eyes narrowed as they assessed the newcomers. The group, as soon as the wagon had stopped, began to move on past the gray team. In the lead was a big, beefy-faced, middle-aged man, dressed in city style, a cream-white wide-brimmed hat, a red and black checkered shirt, and black leather chaps with huge silver conchas. His attire was flashy, almost out of place in the rugged canyon, and his demeanor was equally bold. "Where you think you're heading, fellow?" this man addressed Carvel harshly. His voice was deep and rough, carrying an edge of authority. His eyes, cold and calculating, bore into Dale Carvel's with undisguised suspicion. "I don't see any keep-out signs posted along this road," said the driver quietly. His tone was calm but firm, a subtle challenge to the other man's aggression. He sat straight in the wagon seat, his hands resting lightly on the reins, his gaze steady. "My name is Dale Carvel. I'm here on legitimate business. I ranch over in the Piedras country to the east. A year ago, I bought 5 horses that were raised in this night canyon's country. A while ago, they all headed back for their home range. I paid good money for them, and I've come to get them. If you've got no objections," he added with mild sarcasm. His words were measured, each one carrying the weight of his conviction. "We got plenty objections," growled the beefy rider. His face flushed with anger, his jaw tightening as he spoke. He shifted in his saddle, his hand resting ominously close to the revolver at his side. "I'm George Tucker, manager of the Cross 7 Ranch, and I never sold you any horses. It's a 10-to-1 bet. If you bought any Night Canyon's horses, they were stolen from us. That being the case, you got no claim to them. Turn your outfit and hightail it out of here." His voice rose with each word, his frustration boiling over into outright hostility. The girl's father eyed the 6 riders, and the mild look left his face to be replaced by one of stubborn determination. His jaw set, his eyes hardened, and his grip on the reins tightened. He was not a man to be easily intimidated, and his resolve was clear in every line of his body. "That sounds like an order, Tucker," Cambell stated. His voice was calm, but carried an edge of steel. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze looking with Tucker's. "And I don't work for you or the Cross 7. Furthermore, all this Night River country, except the little used for ranch headquarters, is government land, never has been homesteaded. It's still public domain, and as a citizen, I've got the right to travel over it on my business. I've got a bill of sale from the Grays in Dawn Canyon for those horses, with proper descriptions and brands, and those brands weren't Cross 7, and they had not been blotted. After I find my stray horses, you can look them over to see if you've got any claim or title to them." His words were precise, each one delivered with the confidence of a man who knew his rights and was prepared to defend them. Tucker's big face turned redder, his almost colorless eyes began to glow. His hands clenched into fists, and his breathing grew heavier. The tension between the two men was thick, the air charged with the possibility of violence. "A bunch of thieves, all the Grays," he stormed. His voice was a roar, echoing off the canyon walls. He leaned forward in his saddle, his face contorted with rage. "The whole tribe of them and their neighbors, thieves and worse. Killers. Murderers. I'm giving you one last chance. Get out of here or else." His words were a direct threat, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Or else what?" inquired Cambell unperturbed, but his calm had just the opposite of a quieting effect on Tucker. The rider's big hand fell to the 6-shooter in his holster, but as the ugly snout of the gun came up, Laura Cambell spurred past the wagon to push the blood bay in between her father and Tucker. Her movement was swift and decisive, her gelding responding instantly to her command. At this, Tucker's horse shied, starting his rider to swearing and spurring. The animal reared slightly, its eyes wide with alarm, and Tucker struggled to regain control. His face flushed with anger and embarrassment, his curses filling the air. Then, as the rowling made the horse sheep jump, Tucker holstered his 6-shooter to use both hands to jerk the animal's mouth savagely. His actions were rough, almost brutal, and the horse whinnied in protest. The other riders watched in silence, their expressions a mix of amusement and unease. Sitting her blood bay meanwhile, Laura Cambell, her dark eyes luminous, angrily surveyed the group of them. Her gaze was sharp, her posture defiant, and her presence commanded attention. She was a striking figure, her beauty only heightened by her obvious courage. All of them, in unconscious compliment to the girl's looks, straightened a little in their saddles. Even Tucker, still struggling with his horse, seemed momentarily distracted by her. The tension in the air shifted, the dynamic of the confrontation subtly altered by her intervention. One horse-faced man, black-bearded as a biblical character, with greasy black hair curling from under a torn sombrero, grinned in a loose-lipped way, and slyly began edging his horse closer to the girls. His movements were slow and deliberate, his eyes fixed on Laura with a mixture of curiosity and something darker. The other riders watched him closely, their expressions unreadable as the standoff continued. She was talking to her father. "Dad, do what they say," she urged, her voice trembling with urgency. Her dark eyes were wide with fear, her hands gripping the reins of her blood-bay gelding tightly. "You have no chance against 6 armed men. Turn the team around, let's go back." Dale Carvel shook his head, his expression resolute. "No, Laura, I'm going on." His voice was calm but firm, carrying the weight of his unyielding determination. The girl's gray-mustached father was one of those quiet men whose anger could equal in intensity the loud-mouthed rage represented by Tucker's blustering sort. His weathered face was set in hard lines, his jaw clenched as he stared ahead at the riders blocking their path. "I know I've got no chance against them," he admitted, his tone steady despite the gravity of the situation. "All I've got is a shotgun in the wagon, loaded with birdshot. But a man has a right to travel over government land on his own business, and I'm not turning back. They won't touch you, Laura. If they harm me, you ride back and notify the sheriff." His words were measured, each one carrying the weight of his conviction. He spoke to the team, and the wagon rolled on through the riders, the wooden wheels creaking against the rocky ground. For a few yards it was allowed to proceed, the tension in the air thickening with each passing moment. Then the Cross 7 manager, Tucker, barked an order, his voice sharp and commanding. 2 men at once spurred after the Grays, leaning down to seize their bits. Again the outfit halted, the horses snorting and tossing their heads in protest. Tucker, still yanking viciously on the bloodied mouth of his horse, came up on the off side of the wagon, opposite Laura. His face was flushed with anger, his eyes blazing as he glared at Carvel. "Shooting has been what we handed people passing through here, after we warned them to keep out," he snarled at Carvel, his voice dripping with menace. "But we'd hate to shoot down a father in front of his own girl, so we'll make it a whipping for you, as a special favor. Grab him, some of you, and truss him up against that pine. Maybe losing a little hide will teach him we mean what we say. Yank him down." For a few moments, under the blood-red cliff walls, there was a struggle, a desperate but hopeless one. Pushing past Laura, 2 men had dismounted to climb over a wheel, planning to drag her father from his seat. Their movements were rough and deliberate, their faces set in grim determination as they closed in on Dale Carvel. Behind them, the girl took down her lariat, intending to drop a loop over the pair. Her hands moved swiftly, her mind racing as she sought a way to help her father. "Stop that she-cat, Hale!" yelled Tucker, his voice cutting through the chaos. The man with the curly black beard came in to snatch away the rope, his movements quick and practiced. Then, dropping the lariat, he caught the girl's wrists in his hands, his grip firm and unyielding. Meanwhile, Dale Carvel had landed one hard blow on the jaw of the lank cowboy reaching for him. The impact was sharp, and the cowboy fell back over the wheel, hitting the ground hard. 2 other cowboys, however, seized Carvel, and despite his savage fighting, brought him to the ground. Here they tore off his shirt and undershirt, and a few moments later, Dale Carvel's body, bare above the waist, was plastered against the rough reddish bark of a pine. His muscles tensed as he struggled against his bonds, his face a mask of defiance. Then his arms were bent around the trunk, and the wrists lashed together with a length of thong leather. The cowboys worked quickly, their movements efficient as they secured him to the tree. After that, at a word from Tucker, the lank cowboy that Carvel had hit in the jaw went to get a quirt from his saddle. Laura, her wrists in the vice of the big hands of the man Tucker had called Hale, tried vainly to break loose, while her blood-bay danced nervously. Hale chuckled, his voice low and mocking. Grasping both her wrists in one big wide paw, he put the freed arm around the girl, drawing her slim body close to him. "You ain't no she-cat, you're just a little pigeon, that's what you are," he murmured, his breath hot against her ear. "Cutest little pigeon I ever laid eyes on. Don't you dare hit him." Laura Carvel screamed as she struggled furiously to get loose. The girl was beside herself with horror and anger, her heart pounding in her chest. Looking for some way to free herself, She glanced down at Hale's knee, covered only by a pair of Levi's. Bringing up one leg agilely, she jammed the spur wheel against the man's leg. A loud squall of pain came from Hale, and his grip on the girl's hand slackened. Laura jerked them loose and reached for Hale's six-shooter riding in a holster at his waist. The big hog leg came out of leather, but Tucker was coming in on her left, crashing his horse deliberately into the girl's blood bay. Laura clung desperately to the six-shooter, but before she could use the weapon, Tucker had clamped her arms to her sides. The next instant, he twisted the gun roughly from her hand. The weapon fell to the ground, and with it went the girl's slim chance of helping her father. Hale had captured her wrists again, and was twisting them cruelly. Laura began crying, not because of the pain but in pity for her father. Her tears streamed down her face as she watched the scene unfold, her heart breaking at the sight of her father bound and helpless. "Let him have it, Quinn," yelled Tucker to the man with the quart. "And we ought to give his wildcat daughter a dose of the same medicine." The man lifted the quart high over Carvel's bare back, but before the blow could fall, a clatter of hoofs sounded, and another rider came out of the trees down canyon. A young woman riding side saddle and dressed in an impractical garb for range country, a long green riding habit topped by a sombrero as a concession doubtless to the strong southwestern sun. Her appearance was striking, her presence commanding immediate attention as she reined her horse to a halt, her eyes scanning the scene with a mixture of curiosity and determination. She was blonde, tall, slender, too slender for vigorous health, the face too thin for beauty. Her features were delicate, almost fragile, with high cheekbones and a narrow jawline that gave her an ethereal, almost ghostly appearance. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her lips were pressed into a thin, unsmiling line. Her eyes, a deep blue in color, were dull, dead, with a definite look of haunting melancholy. They seemed to carry the weight of some unseen burden, their gaze distant and unfocused, as though she were lost in thoughts too heavy to share. Her expression was one of quiet resignation, as if she had long since accepted a life of sorrow and hardship. She rode straight to the tree to which Dale Carvel was bound, her movements graceful despite the impracticality of her long green riding habit. Her horse, a sleek chestnut mare, moved with a smooth, unhurried gait, its hooves crunching softly against the rocky ground. As she approached, her eyes flicked over the scene, taking in the bound man, the tense cowboys, and the distraught girl struggling in Hale's grip. "I asked you to wait down canyon for us, Miss Linda," said Tucker, his voice tinged with irritation. He shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, his eyes narrowing as he watched her. "What are you doing here?" The girl returned his gaze steadily, her expression unreadable. "What has this man done, Tucker?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "Who is he?" "You can see for yourself what we're doing," Tucker told her sullenly, his tone defensive. He gestured toward Dale Carvel, his jaw tightening as he spoke. "We never saw him before. Him and his daughter say they want to hunt some stray horses they claim they bought from the Grays. Most likely horses the Grays stole from us, if there was any horses like he claims. It's my idea he's a Gray spy. We can't allow no stranger in here on our range, you know that. Mr. Carter has given orders to stop anyone coming in on the ranch." "If this man had intended any harm," the girl pointed out, her voice sharp with logic, "he wouldn't risk bringing in his own daughter. Since there's no other wagon road to Dawn Canyon, he's entitled to travel through our range to the Gray Ranch to get back his horses. Give him a reasonable time to find them and take them out." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the men before settling back on Tucker. "I don't understand why you have to count everyone as our enemies. You and Turnpike take it for granted that anyone coming into this country comes to do us harm." "And we got a right to take that for granted," burst out Tucker, his voice rising with frustration. His face flushed, and his hands clenched into fists as he leaned forward in his saddle. "We didn't start what's been started in here. One of the Grays and a neighbor killed your father, didn't they? And they've killed 5 of our Cross-7 men, haven't they? It's us against the Grays, and the rest of those ranchers in Dawn and Star Canyons. They've been stealing our horses, and now that they've started shooting us down, we got to fight back. I'm having this man whipped so him and other men will learn to keep off our range." His voice had an almost fanatical earnestness, his words tumbling out in a rush of anger and conviction. "I say to turn him loose," said the girl sharply, her tone cutting through Tucker's tirade. Her eyes flashed with a rare spark of defiance, and she straightened in her saddle, her chin lifted. "Lashing a man for just crossing our range is beastly and inhuman. Turn him loose." Tucker, evidently, was having trouble reaching a decision. A powerful man physically, with a huge store of vitality, he plainly was a slow thinker. His brow furrowed as he wrestled with the girl's words, his jaw working as though he were chewing over the problem. The other men patiently waited for his orders, their expressions blank and uninterested. Except for the black-bearded man, Hale, they appeared to take little interest in the affair. It was just another job to them. Having to make up his mind seemed to enrage Tucker almost to the point of bursting. His dark-colored face turned purple, and he muttered to himself, his hands gripping the reins so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Finally, he spat out, "All right, turn him loose." His voice was gruff, his tone begrudging, but the order was clear. "But listen to me, you," he snarled at Carvel's back, his eyes blazing with barely contained fury. "You can go on to the Grays. The road to Dawn Canyon turns up a side canyon to the right up there a ways. We'll give you 3 days to get back through here, and we'll look over any horses you take out." He turned to Hale, his voice sharp. "Turn the girl loose, Hale." Freed, Carvel silently replaced his torn clothing, his movements deliberate and unhurried. His face was a mask of calm, but his eyes burned with a quiet intensity as he addressed Tucker. "If you had had me whipped," he declared, his voice low and steady, "I'd have killed you for it." He would have said more, but Laura Carvel dismounted to lay a hand on her father's arm, urging him toward the wagon. Her touch was gentle but insistent, her eyes pleading with him to let it go. "And don't you turn a foot off that road to Dawn Canyon," said Tucker as a final word, his voice carrying a note of warning. "Don't hunt for horses on this range. If you brought them from the Grays, they wouldn't have come back here. That turning off don't apply to you, little pigeon," the black-bearded Hale told Laura Carvel, his little pig-like eyes gleaming with a predatory light. His voice was low and oily, his words dripping with innuendo. "You can turn off any time you want to. Just so you turn my way." At this, Carvel swung angrily on Hale, his fists clenched and his eyes blazing with fury. But before he could act, the girl on the black horse spoke up, her voice cutting through the tension like a whiplash. "Hale," she remarked sharply, her tone icy and commanding, "keep a decent tongue in your head." Her words were firm, leaving no room for argument, and Hale's grin faltered as he averted his gaze, muttering something under his breath. The Carvel wagon creaked on again, its wooden wheels groaning against the uneven terrain, with the loose horses trailing after it. Laura Carvel rode over close to the girl in the riding habit, her heart still pounding from the ordeal. "Thank God you stopped them," she said in a low voice, her gratitude evident in every word. Her dark eyes were wide with emotion, and she reached out to touch the other girl's arm briefly. "I'll never forget that. Never." The rider of the black horse was at least 3 or 4 years older than Laura. She looked at Laura gravely now, as though regarding a child, and then she smiled, though her expression was tinged with sadness. "I'm only sorry it happened," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight of regret. "Adios." As the outfit moved on, the wagon wheels jolting hard over stones and the horses picking their way carefully, the girl on the black horse watched the slim, graceful figure of Laura Carvel. In her blue eyes, with their tragic cast, there was plain envy. She sat motionless for a moment, her gaze lingering on Laura's retreating form, before finally turning her horse away. Silently, the whole group of cross-7 riders watched until the wagon and horses were out of sight. Leif Hale, with his loose-lipped smile, kept his small pig-like eyes fixed on the girl on the blood bay, his expression unreadable but unsettling. Tucker, meanwhile, frowned at the sun, which was low enough to send a path of golden rays over the pines, creating a comb-like pattern along the ridge. "Getting late," he muttered, his voice gruff as he shifted in his saddle. "Yes," agreed the woman on the black horse, her tone distant. She stared off into the distance, her thoughts seemingly far away. "I wish I could trade places with that girl, Tucker. She seems really happy without a worry. She's of the sun, while all of us that live here in these night river canyons are of the shadow. And there is nothing ahead for us but shadows." Tucker looked somberly at his horse's ears, his expression darkening as he considered her words. "We'll have the shadows cleared up for long, Miss Linda," he said gravely, his voice heavy with conviction. "And then we'll have plenty of sun, all the sun there is for ourselves. We're due for a big ruckus, but when it's ended, we'll have those grays wiped out, and we'll have all the canyons of the night to ourselves." He spoke with the certainty of a man who had few ideas, but held those few firmly fixed in his mind. The woman shivered, though the air was warm. Her hands tightened on the reins, and she glanced over her shoulder, as if expecting danger to appear at any moment. "Let's go back," she said abruptly, her voice tinged with unease. At her command, the group turned and began moving along the canyon at a jog trot. 2 men rode 100 yards in front, their rifles resting across their saddle horns, ready for instant use. Tucker rode beside Miss Linda, his eyes scanning the terrain with a practiced vigilance, while 3 more men brought up the rear. The tension among them was palpable, their movements deliberate and cautious, as though they were constantly braced for an attack. As they rode, the shadows of the canyon deepened, the golden light of the setting sun giving way to the cool blue hues of twilight. The men kept their rifles at the ready, their eyes darting to every rock and tree, every possible hiding place. The sound of hoof-beats echoed off the canyon walls, a steady rhythm that underscored the silence of the group. Miss Linda rode in silence, her thoughts clearly troubled. Her eyes, once again dull and distant, seemed to reflect the weight of the shadows she had spoken of earlier. She glanced at Tucker occasionally, but her gaze always returned to the path ahead, as though searching for something she knew she would never find. The cross-7 riders moved with a practiced efficiency, their movements coordinated and precise. They were a hardened group, accustomed to danger and violence, but even they seemed affected by the somber mood that had settled over them. The canyon stretched on ahead, its walls looming higher as the light faded, and the shadows grew longer, deeper, and more impenetrable. Chapter 2. Abe Perkins, who was Rip Cambell's partner on a small cattle ranch, was frequently heard to declare that his young partner had been born a few decades too late. Rip, Abe maintained, should have lived in the days when he could have trapped the Rockies in the company of Kit Carson, Jim Bridger, and their kind. Rip liked hunting and catching wild mustangs more than he did ranching. The business of ranching often bored him, and at such times he would load a pack horse, whistle to a half-dozen hounds, and ride back into isolated country to hunt and trap. A few weeks or months later, looking as wild as a wolf, he would reappear, ready for another stint of ranch work. A few inches over 6 feet, loose, rangy, with a deep, good-humored voice, Rip Cambell, in a buckskin quill-ornamented jacket, made a striking figure lounging now against the bar of the Coulter Saloon in the town of Hurley. After a trip of 100 miles from their home, he and Abe Perkins, a gray-mustached man of 60, had ridden into Hurley that morning with 2 pack horses. Having made camp on the outskirts of the place and hobbled their horses, they had spent the hours since loafing about the town. Standing with them now, In the Coulter Bar and Gambling Place was Fred Carter, president of the Big Cross 7 Ranch Company. Carter was a transplanted Easterner, a city man, dressed in a business suit with English riding boots, a long-headed reddish-blonde man of 45 who would have looked entirely in place at a bank directors' meeting. Abe and Rip had practically forced their company on the rancher, Carter being the snobbish sort who did not readily pick up acquaintances with strangers. Abe and Rip were drinking beer, sparingly. Carter was drinking scotch, a lot of it, and warming up a little under its influence. The two had been lucky in having found Carter in town that day, but that was as far as their luck went. They had come to the Hurley country to make a deal with Carter for Cross 7 horses, but Carter had declared curtly that he had no horses for sale. "The Cross 7 is not selling horses, I tell you," snapped Carter when Abe Perkins brought up the matter for the third time. "They would need gathering, and we haven't time to do that just now. We have more important matters to attend to." "We'll do the gathering," offered Perkins. "And we'd pay mighty good money for 100 head or so that we got a chance to turn a profit on. We'll give you 100 apiece for 3 to 5-year-old mares and geldings." "That's mighty good money." "Good money," admitted Carter, startled. "And you can make money paying that much for unbroken horses?" "Yeah," stated Rip Cambell. "These Night Canyon horses are some of the best in the West, and they've got looks besides. We know a bunch of Easterners that will pay big money for horses to stock the ranch they just bought. We'll pay you $1,000 down now as earnest money, the rest when we tally out the 100 head. For the first time, Carter considered the deal. "The ranch could use that money," he said. "Those horses do us no good out there just running on the range." "You say you can gather them yourself? They're hard to corral in those canyons." "I know that country, Mr. Carter," said Abe Perkins. "Like I told you, I rode for the Cross 7 some years ago. That's our offer, 100 apiece for 100 head, totaling $10,000. Perkins and Campbell, glancing at Carter, knew that the man was seriously turning over their offer. There was a money look in his light blue eyes. "You've got the $1,000 earnest money in cash?" he asked. Abe Perkins promptly pulled out a roll of bills, but another man had strolled up to the bar, stepping in between Carter and the other two. Perkins recognized the proprietor of the saloon and gambling place, Gid Coulter. Abe had noticed him earlier, standing and talking to a customer who was doing some solitary heavy drinking at a nearby table. The customer seemed vaguely familiar to Abe, but he hadn't been able to place him. "Hello, Coulter," said Abe. "Still doing business at the old stand, I see. Many a dollar of hard-earned wages I lost in here a long time ago when I worked for the Cross 7. "Nobody asked you to lose your money in here," Coulter rasped. The saloon man was tall and raw-boned, with a battered, hook-nosed face. "Seems to me I heard you talking about selling some horses, Carter." "Probably I heard wrong." "It's mighty easy money, Coulter," said Carter. $10,000 for 100 head, that's the offer. "We got so many horses out there running wild that they're eating the range poor." "I wouldn't sell no horses now, Carter," growled Coulter. "Not with these other things to attend to. Step back in the office and we'll talk it over." Coulter's voice was uncompromising and harsh. It was the wrong tone to use on Carter, who had had too many drinks of scotch. "What's there to talk over?" Carter returned, arrogantly. "I'm president of the Cross 7, and capable, I trust, of running its affairs. We need money. What's a better way to get it than to sell horses?" "I'll take your offer," he told Abe Perkins and Rip Cambell. "Hand over that money, and I'll give you a receipt." "It would be businesslike, I guess, to have a sales agreement besides a receipt," said Rip Cambell. Taking a pencil and sheet of paper from a pocket, he began writing on the bar top. "Now look here, Carter," put in Coulter. I say we'll talk this over first. You're drunk and don't know what you're doing." Carter, who was a plain snob when sober and worse when drunk, turned on the saloon man. "My dear Coulter," he said sarcastically, "will you kindly concern yourself with your own business?" "All right," growled Coulter abruptly, and his greenish eyes held a glare that boded no good for Carter. "Have it your own way." He retreated to his office, staying there while the deal for the horses was completed, the sales agreement signed, and the $1,000 paid over. During that interval, the hard-drinking customer at the table had gotten up to stroll into Coulter's private office, closing the door behind him. Carter tucked the money in his pocket and promptly left the saloon. Cambell and Perkins were about to follow when Gid Coulter emerged from his office and strode toward them. "You men probably think you've made a good deal," he remarked, trying hard to appear friendly. "But there's a war on in those canyons of the night. You'll get shot if you go in, by one side or the other. The Grays and the McWhirters and the Neals got 2 of the 7 canyons on the east side of the river, and the Cross 7 has the other 5. They've been fighting to see who gets them all. The principal owner of the Cross 7, Stevens, was killed in a gun battle not long ago. This city dude Carter, was running the ranch, has no more business managing a horse ranch than I got ramrodding a Sunday school. If I were you, I'd keep out of that fight. Carter and his punchers can't protect you from the Grays and their neighbors." "The Grays used to be decent folks when I worked here before," remarked Abe. "Tough now, are they?" "Tough. You bet they're tough. I wouldn't ride through those canyons now for all the horses in the West. 5 of the Cross 7 men have been killed, besides Addison Stevens." "You take a lot of interest in our health," said Rip coolly. "I'd like to ask why." Coulter stared at Cambell hard. "You could ask," he rasped out, "and I'd tell you that it's none of your damn business, except that it happens I don't want you or anybody else in that country. Is that plain?" The saloon man had raised his voice suddenly, so that his words could be heard over the entire room. Rip and Perkins quickly glanced about them. The gambling establishment in the Coulter saloon occupied over half of the big room. A half-dozen dealers were on duty, lounging about their tables and layouts, since the saloon was practically empty. These dealers, Perkins and Cambell noticed, were suddenly alert. All were armed with 6-shooters. The faro lookout was holding an ugly-looking shotgun over his knees. Rip realized this Coulter saloon and gambling place could be a tough spot. He himself was not armed. He never went armed into a town. He went armed in wildernesses where he might run into a grizzly on the rampage. Abe Perkins wore an old Bisley Model 6-shooter stuck behind his belt. Abe moved now so that he faced both the dealers and Coulter, with his hand just above the handmade cedar handles of the gun. "I wouldn't start anything, Coulter," said Abe. "I'm old, but I can still plug $1 in the belly at 30 paces. My friend's got no gun, but he don't need one. That young'un without a shootin' iron is more dangerous than you are with one, Coulter. With his bare hands he could tear you apart, you and any 2 men you got in here. And what he can't tear apart, I'll sure shoot apart." For a moment, Coulter stared at Abe Perkins's Bisley. Then he looked at Rip Cambell in his garb that was reminiscent of the old fur trapper days. Meanwhile, the dealers in the place looked at their employer for some signal. Abruptly, Coulter shrugged his shoulders. "If you want to go in and buy horses off the Cross 7, all right," he stated. "It's no funeral of mine." Turning, he strolled back into his office. Coulter had backed down, but when Perkins and Cambell left, they kept a wary eye on the Coulter dealers. Outside, the pair looked at the little town, built on a slope of the monster canyon cut by the night river. Upstream, in an enormous bend of the river, were the 7 so-called canyons of the night, dusk in which the Cross 7 headquarters lay, and 4 sister canyons comprising the Cross 7 range, dark, twilight, moon, and midnight. Closer, explained Abe Perkins, were the two canyons, Dawn and Star, in which were the ranches of the Grays, the Neals, and the McWhirters. Nothing to keep us from travelin' into them canyons now, 'ceptin' our good sense, remarked Abe, and the two headed for their camp. A big flop-eared hound came out to greet Rip, leaping up on him and giving one deep bark. Rip patted the black and tan hide of the animal, called Savvy because he was a smart dog with lots of savvy. Bringing in their hobbled horses, they packed up and prepared to travel, although the sun was already swinging low over the rims. "I don't like this trip," Abe Perkins grumbled as he tightened a pack saddle cinch. "That gambler wasn't telling us no fairy story about how dangerous it is down there with a war on, between the Cross 7 outfit and their neighbors in Dawn and Star canyons. There's always a lot of tough cowboys riding them canyons. Nobody would ever work that rough country, excepting outlaws on the dodge." "Is that why you took a job there?" asked Rip slyly. "Yes, it was," the other man admitted frankly. "I had to go on the dodge for a few years, until the trouble I was in cleared up. Best horses I ever seen down there, but them canyons is just good places for funerals. 1,000 feet straight down in some places. Them canyons had me spooked then, and they still got me spooked. I'm telling you, I got a feeling we'll never get back out of there." Rip Cambell chuckled. "You ought to get yourself a gypsy outfit and tell fortunes for $1 a throw. Better buy yourself a quart of liquid courage before you leave town." "It'd take a barrel to help me," Abe said whimsically as he slapped the saddle on his horse. "The kind of shivers I got now would take more'n whiskey to warm up. No, sir, I didn't like this from the time that nab woman sent me $1,000 cash to hand Fred Carter as down money in a deal to buy horses. I couldn't see no sense to handing out $1,000 for nothing. What was to keep me from just waltzing in, I thought. But that woman was right. She wrote that any other way it wouldn't be safe. Strangers found in them night canyons are shot on sight, with gun hands just hired to exterminate Grays and Neals. I can't believe it. When I worked on the ranch, Addison Stevens was plumb friendly with the Grays. But he's dead now, and this here Carter is in charge. A different breed." Abe's jaw suddenly fell, and he stopped his work. "Now I know that fattish feller that sat at the table," he exclaimed. "Hamlin Stevens, Addison's half-brother. He used to be a slim sort. Owned some stock in the ranch, and used to come there to live and hunt in between traveling to Europe and back. Drinkin'est feller I ever heard of. 2 quarts a day was nothing to him when he was going good. But he was quiet on his drunks, not no hellraiser." "Not like you then," remarked Rip as a joke. "Come on, get that horse loaded. You can chatter later." They set out, jogging along with jouncing pack boxes and with the hound Savvy sniffing at trails but following none, knowing this was not a day to hunt. But after the hound had scared 2 young grouse whirring into a pine, Rip shot them. Grouse would make a good supper. Reaching the rim of a deep canyon, Abe halted. "Moon Canyon," he said. "Next one to it is Dusk, where the Cross 7 headquarters is located. Might as well camp here, it's getting late. I used to stop here often, years ago when I was riding for the Cross 7. Rip hobbled their horses while Abe cooked supper. The return to the country where he had ridden years before had put the oldish Perkins in a sentimental and reminiscent mood. "It's sort of like one of these romances you read about in books," confessed Abe as they ate. "This here Margaret McNabb woman, we called her Nab. She looks rough as an alligator, but underneath she's got a soft heart and a big one. She was on the ranch as nurse to that motherless little girl Linda Stevens when I was riding there. That little girl couldn't 'a' had a better mother. That Nab was a mighty fine nurse too. She saved my life one time I had pneumonia. That's when I fell for her, hard." "Why didn't you marry her?" demanded Rip. "I'd have done it in a second. The only reason why I didn't is Nab wouldn't have me then. Said she was going to stick to this little girl, Linda Stevens, that Linda, being without a mother, needed her more than I did. So when I left the ranch, I told her, Nab, if you ever need a worthless roughneck to perform some trifling service, let me know. And she promised me she would, but I never heard nothing more all these years until I got that letter from her. She said the Stevens girl had been sent back east to school a few years back, and Nab had gone to the coast to nurse in some hospital. Now she was back on the ranch again, sort of as companion for Linda Stevens, who was all grown up. She said that Linda's pa had been killed in a gunfight, and if I was still willing to give that help, I offered once to let her know, but that it might mean a risk to my life. So I wrote her back I'd come, and that's when she sent the 1,000 cash so I'd get on the Cross 7 disguised as a horse buyer. That's all right, but I hadn't no call to get you into it. You didn't get me into it, disagreed Rip. I begged for the chance to come along. And anyway, I owe you something. I haven't forgotten how you took me in after Dad died. Abe spat tobacco juice. You don't owe me nothing for that. You could have raised yourself from the time you was a 5-year-old wiener, living by hunting and trapping. Nobody had to take you in. All right, said Rip good-humoredly. There's no debt on either side. And I just came along for a chance to look at these night river horses and see some new country, and to see this Nab lady fall into your arms. Savvy, busy with part of a grouse carcass, suddenly began a low growling. Abe scolded the hound. Let him growl, said Rip. Savvy's hearing something and warning us against it. And by his growl, it's no coyote smelling our grub. It's something more serious. Savvy smells a man. According to you, that hound can talk, Abe hoorah'd his partner. That brute'll get you into trouble some day. He'll tackle a bear and then run back to get behind you for protection. Not savvy, returned Rip. I'm going to douse the fire, and when I do, you jump back into the brush. And don't waste any time jumping. That's a man savvy smelling back there. Leaning forward, he swiftly spilled a canvas bucket of water over the small flame. As steam and smoke arose, he and Abe leapt back into the darkness. Seconds later, came the crash of a rifle sounding from the direction of a rocky point behind camp. A second shot came a moment later. Rip, grabbing a rifle from his bedroll, shouted to Savvy, "Go get him, boy!" When the hound, with a deep bark, streaked toward the little rocky hill, Rip was close at the dog's heels. There were no other shots, but as the hound's voice lifted again in a booming bark, up ahead came the quick drum of horse hoofs and the crash of a horse through the brush. Savvy pursued hotly, as the fleeing rider kept to the dense cover of pinon and cedar, racing away from the camp. Rip realized the man would put a bullet into the hound if Savvy got too close, and taking a whistle from a pocket, he sent a shrill blast to recall the dog from his hopeless chase. Before he returned to camp, Rip found the boot tracks of the ambusher not many yards from the camp. Using several matches, he photographed their shape in his mind and took measurements with a piece of string. Abe had built up the fire again and was stomping about angrily when Rip returned. "The blasted killer," he growled. "All set to take a pot shot at us. Likely sneaking up to get close-range shots at us when you put out that fire. Lucky that hound smelled him out." "Yeah," agreed Rip, searching about in his bedroll and bringing out a pair of Indian moccasins, which he began exchanging for his high-heeled riding boots. "That bird came from the direction of Hurley. He was sent out likely by someone there. I'd mention your old friend Coulter if it wouldn't hurt your feelings." "I'd like to hurt Coulter with a hot 6-gun slug," grunted Abe, "if 'twas him that sent that buzzard after us." "You sure ain't goin' chasing a feller at night in this country afoot," he protested, watching Rip put on the moccasins. "It's going to storm, and in the dark there's cliffs where if you fell off you'd land about in time for breakfast, only it'd be some buzzard's breakfast, not yours." Rip swiftly laced the moccasins. "I got a pair of night eyes, and I'll take Savvy along on a leash to guide me. I've got to go afoot. If I rode a horse, that fellow would hear me coming a mile away." "Going afoot after a man on a horse," exclaimed Abe, and then abruptly shut up. He knew that Rip was a buckaroo who had ridden bad outlaw horses and, as a mountain cowboy, had roped bulls on treacherous slopes. Abe also knew that in hunting, Rip and his pack of hounds had run innumerable bear and lion in country too rough to ride a horse over, and had done it for hours at a stretch. Rip could travel all day at a trot. Most lion and bear hunters can. They usually have to, in following their hounds on a hot trail. Standing by the campfire in his buckskin jacket, Rip looked like an Indian, except that his features were too square and his eyes were blue. He put a knife in a scabbard at his waist, wrapped a little bread, jerky, and coffee into a package, and dropped a dozen rifle cartridges into a pocket. "I feel like taking a little run," he remarked. "If I don't come back tonight, you move the outfit on tomorrow to the Cross 7 headquarters. I'll join you there. If Savvy was a little bigger, you could put a saddle on his back and ride him," said Abe. "But I hate to see you go, Rip. It's risky, following a bushwhacker like that in rough country. He may lay for you, or he may travel 50 miles before he stops." Rip shrugged and picked up the carbine. "I won't kick at going 50 miles after that hombre. I aim to find out who would sneak up on us to ambush us. Want to ask him why he did it." "Better put a bullet in him first and ask him later," cautioned Abe Perkins. "They play marbles for keeps in this Night River country, and they use slugs for marbles." Chapter 3. Savvy had no trouble picking up the trail of the horse ridden by the would-be dry gulcher. The rider had headed down into Moon Canyon on the trail Rip and Abe had followed from town. Savvy trotted down it, sniffing occasionally, tugging on his leash but not very hard, whining a little in a bored way. Savvy wasn't too keen to be on this trail. There was nothing exciting about following a tame horse. It was just a job. Chasing a rabbit would have been more fun and sport. The canyon bottom was wide, fairly level, and clear of trees. Off under the peaks, a storm was brewing, but here the moon was out to show a wagon road. The rider was following this road, and after him trotted Savvy mile after mile, with Rip jogging along tirelessly in his moccasins. Out of this canyon, the road angled finally to climb through a long pass in a ridge. Then, crossing a wide mesa, it dropped into another canyon. From Abe's description, Rip knew that this would be Dusk Canyon, in which lay the Cross 7 headquarters. He rested a minute or so, listening to the night noise of the wind through the pines on the slopes, lulled by it, as if by music from a great organ. Then again, man and dog went on. The road forked, one branch climbing into a side canyon. The horse tracks were plain in the moonlight, turning up the side canyon. Rip turned with them. Several times, he thought he could catch the sound of a horse's steel shoes up ahead. It did not surprise Rip that he should be overtaking the horsemen. Ordinarily, men did not ride fast at night in canyon country, a jog at best, and Rip had trotted almost steadily since he had left Abe. He increased his pace a little. Clouds were beginning to drift across the moon and stars, and the road angled back and forth along a dark wooded slope. Rip was 100 yards or more from what he judged was the canyon rim when he heard the crash of a gun, a 6-shooter above him. 2 or 3 seconds later there was another shot, then a third. Rip halted, listening hard. Whoever was doing the shooting was certainly not firing at him. After a little period of silence, came the sound of a horse running away, tearing through brush with a clatter of flopping empty stirrups. Plainly, the horse was riderless. Savvy growled, but Rip silenced him. Another horse was in motion now, going across the mesa with the regular hoof beats of a lope. Rip began climbing again, following the road at a trot with Savvy padding ahead of him. The moon was blanketed by clouds. A few stars gave a little light. The most plausible explanation for the shots was that the man he and Savvy had been trailing had met another rider, and there had been a short fight between the two. One man had been knocked from his saddle, and his horse had run off without him. The other, not waiting to make sure whether he had killed his man or not, had loped away. On the rim, Rip hesitated for a moment. From the thick darkness of a clump of cedars and piñons came the sound of a human voice, raised in what seemed a faint call for help. He moved toward it warily, for as Abe had said, this was dangerous country. Savvy growled a little. He stopped to tie the dog to a tree. After that, he cat-footed along, carbine in his hand, moccasins pressing down softly until he was certain there were no sticks to crack under them. There was no further call, but he heard several groans. Someone had been shot, but an injured man, if still alive, can be as dangerous to someone wanting to help him as to an enemy. Pushing aside a growth of small pines, Rip looked out on a little open space. The light was just sufficient to show the dark blot of a man lying on his back. Rip moved in quietly to kneel by the fellow's side, first making sure that the fellow had no gun. The wounded man's hands were empty and drawn up under his right shoulder. Rip struck a match, cupped it. The man was a long, sandy-haired cowboy, somewhere in his early 20s. His eyes were closed. Another match, in a swift examination, showed that his pair of high-heeled boots were much smaller than those worn by the man who had ambushed Rip and Abe. This cowboy was a victim of that ambusher, which warmed Rip to him at once. Building a little fire out of dry twigs, he took away the clenched hands and found blood soaking the flannel shirt just below the shoulder. Cutting away part of the shirt revealed a hole made by a bullet, which had smashed through the man's right side high up, leaving a gaping wound from which blood flowed freely. To staunch the flow, Rip divided his neckerchief to make 2 wads, fastening them with strips of cloth torn from the man's shirt. Hearing the murmur of a creek not far away, he brought a hat full of water to pour some down the throat of the man, who had begun to whisper faintly, "Water," still without opening his eyes. There was not much help Rip could give. A doctor was needed here. They were, Rip knew, somewhere on the big mesa above the Cross 7 headquarters in Dusk Canyon. He could go down the trail and along the canyon bottom until he came to the ranch, but that would be a long time to leave the young fellow, maybe too long. In cutting away the blood-soaked shirt, he'd heard paper crinkle in a pocket. Examining the paper now, he found it was a letter addressed to one Tom Gray. If this were one of the Grays, deadly enemies of the Cross 7, that did away with his idea of going to the Cross 7 for help. There would be no help there for a Gray. Looking about him, he suddenly saw a faint glimmer of light through the pines to the north. Climbing a little hill, he could see the mounting flames of a fire started recently since he had not seen it before. It offered a prospect of help, and he started off on a trot. Near the campfire, which was burning low by the time he came near it, he saw the gray tarp of a covered wagon. He raised a hail. It was not answered, but as he went close to the wagon, a voice sounded from behind him, a feminine voice. "Drop that rifle," the voice ordered him firmly. "Then put up your hands and march toward that fire, and don't try any tricks." "Yes, ma'am." "No, ma'am," he said meekly, and letting his carbine fall, went along with his hands up. He grinned a little. He liked that voice, despite the attempt of its owner to make it sound very harsh and forceful. Reaching the fire, he calmly used a foot to kick up the fire, then turned to look at his captor. She was a girl of 16 at most, he judged, garbed in a blue skirt, leather jacket, and high-heeled boots. Her hair, brown with luminous lights caught from the fire, was fluffed above a dark-eyed face that was the prettiest Rip had ever seen. A mighty cute kid, despite the double-barreled shotgun she held in a businesslike manner. "Sorry to disturb you, miss," he said, but I ran onto a man who's been shot and is in a bad way. He's lying close to the place where this road drops through the rim rock. I'd like to bring him here to be taken care of. Laying out in the open, he won't have much chance to pull through." "I heard the shots," said the girl. "That's why I built up the fire. I was figuring to go over and investigate." "But you found him, you say? Is he?" She hesitated. "I'm worried about my father. He rode off today and hasn't come back yet." "That isn't the direction he went, but—" her voice broke off. "It can't be your father," Rip assured her hastily. "A young fellow. One of the Grays. At any rate, he carried a letter in his pocket addressed to Tom Gray. I'm a stranger in this country, but the man that shot him, I'm positive, is the same hombre that fired at my partner and me in our camp above Moon Canyon tonight." The shotgun lowered a little, then only to be brought sharply up again. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" she demanded. "Why would I tell you anything else?" he returned simply. "The only way I can prove it is to show you that young fellow. Right now, you'll just have to take my word that I'm not a liar." "I know you're not lying," said the girl quickly, and as if to show she was ashamed of having doubted him, she at once leaned the gun against a wagon wheel. "Can you bring him here on a horse?" "Only way to get him here, I guess, although I hate to run the risk of all that jolting. If there was another man, we could carry him on a stretcher." "Are you alone here?" She nodded. "Yes. We're strangers in here, too. We were traveling to see the Grays about some horses that strayed back to this country, and we came to a stretch of road that we couldn't get the wagon across. Dad said he'd ride on alone and leave me in camp. He'd have taken me along, but it's dangerous riding through this country, and he intended to be gone only a day. But why don't we make a stretcher for this man? I can carry my end of it." Rip looked at her wiry body. "I guess you could," he admitted. "This young Gray is tall, but not so heavy. I'll cut a couple of poles, if you'll get a piece of tarp." By the fire they worked, fastening a strip of stout canvas to two tough poles Rip had cut. Then, with Rip carrying the makeshift stretcher and a canteen of water, they started out, walking fast over the rough ground. He had Savvy tied near the wounded man, and the hound gave a deep bark as they came near. Surprisingly, Rip found young Gray conscious and even able to talk a little. He stared up at Rip and asked, "Who are you?" "Someone that's willing to help you, mister. My name is Rip Cambell. I ranch over in the Cradle River country. And this girl's father rode to see you Grays about some stray horses. He hasn't come back yet. Maybe you met him. He bought some horses from some of your family some time ago." "His name is Dale Carvel," put in the girl. "You haven't seen him?" "No," said the wounded man. "But I left the ranch early today. Your horses came back. My brother Ed said they were the ones he'd sold." Rip held the canteen to Gray's lips, and Gray swallowed a little. "You know what man you met up here?" asked Rip. "The fellow that shot you?" Gray hesitated a moment, then shook his head. "Wouldn't tell us, I reckon, if you did," said Rip. "Want to look after your own wolf scalping? We'll have to get a doctor for you. Nearest one, I suppose, is in Hurley." "No, none there. My uncle, Will Gray, is a doctor, the best in Night River country. Lives over on a ranch near Dad's in Dawn Canyon. I'll be able to ride back in a couple hours if I can get a horse. I wish you'd get word to, too." Another gusty sigh came. Then, weak from the strain of talking, he fainted. The blood flow from the wound had dwindled, but plainly a ride, even a short one, would start it again. They placed Gray on the stretcher and started out, walking slowly so as to jar him as little as possible. Thunder was rumbling from a cloud bank to the northwest. Rip led the way, enabled by his freakish eyes to avoid brush and boulders, despite the darkness made by the approaching storm. The girl tired, but she was game, refusing to stop longer than a few seconds to rest. Reaching the camp, they placed Gray in a comfortable bed Laura Cambell made in the wagon for him. There, Rip undressed the man. Meanwhile, the girl had prepared bandages, and together they washed the dirt from about the ugly wound as best they could without disturbing the blood clots. The bleeding had practically stopped, but a high fever had begun to burn the man's body. In delirium, he began to mumble a few words. Laura Cambell glanced up at Rip in astonishment. Why, he's saying the name of that girl from the Cross 7, the one who saved Dad from being whipped by those brutes yesterday, Linda Stevens. He wants word gotten to her. But I thought the Stevens and Gray families are enemies. They are, said Rip. I heard in town that Addison Stevens was found with a Gray and a neighbor, all dead of bullets. This cowboy may be a friend of the Stevens girl, but I've got a hunch he has to be kept hidden from the Cross 7 bunch, that his life won't be worth much if they find him. We could take him on in the wagon toward the Grays if the road wasn't washed out. But you wouldn't be here if it hadn't been washed out. I don't know what to do with him. It's going to rain, which will wipe out our tracks carrying him over here. But I doubt if it's safe to leave him in the wagon. Likely a Cross 7 rider shot him, and that fellow may ride up here in the morning to see what happened to the man he potted. She nodded agreement. The wagon is off the road, but it can be easily seen, and if anybody comes into camp, they could hear Gray moaning. But what can we do? I can borrow a horse from you to ride for his doctor uncle to attend to him. Maybe he'll say it's safe to move him home. Meanwhile, he can be hidden in that rocky ridge back of here, with a shelter rigged up against the rain. But I don't like to leave you here alone in this ornery country. You better ride with me to the Grays. Your dad is likely there by now. Go away and leave Gray by himself? Laura Cambell shook her head. I couldn't do that. And Dad might come back here and find me gone. Not that I wouldn't like to be out of here. I've been scared ever since I came down into these deep canyons, and I'll stay scared until we get out. If Dad doesn't come back, and he isn't at the Grays, I'll have to hunt for him tomorrow. A few drops of rain hissed into the fire. Rip looked at his watch. It was still an hour before midnight. By morning, enough rain would have fallen to cover the tracks they had made carrying Gray to camp. Taking a lantern and axe, he set off into the low rocky ridge. 100 yards away, he found a semi-cave made by a huge boulder that had fallen against a cliff. No horseman could reach the spot without dismounting. No man afoot could see it without a close search. A few poles and a tarpaulin would make a snug shelter against wind and rain. After he had the shelter prepared, he brought up Dale Carvel's bedroll and a jug of water. Placing the blankets on a bed made of pine needles, he stretched the tarp for a door. After that, he and Laura Cambell put Gray on a stretcher again and transferred him to the shelter. She was to stay with the wounded man during the night. She could, as Rip pointed out, go to and from the wagon along a rocky path without leaving tracks, although the rain, now slogging down steadily, would take care of that. Back in the camp, Rip saddled one of the camp horses, lengthening the stirrups on Laura's saddle. The wagon road leading to the Gray ranches in Dawn Canyon would be difficult to follow in the rain, but he was used to traveling strange country at night. I think Tom Gray is in love with Linda Stevens, Laura said, as they drank coffee from a fresh pot she had prepared. He keeps saying her name. If it came to the worst, she'd help him. Maybe she's not in love with him, said Rip. And she might turn him over to her relatives instead. No, said Laura Cambell firmly, she's not that kind. I saw her. She seemed to be so unhappy herself that she'd hate to make anyone else unhappy. She's sick, I don't mean with a disease. Just sick inside. Unhappy. And I think that she's unhappy because she and this Gray are in love and their families are fighting. Rip grinned. Just like a girl to think that, he remarked. You've been reading a lot of romances. No use to fill your mind with that stuff now. Time for that later. Yes, she scoffed. How old do you think I am, anyway? He looked at her suddenly and frowned. Older, I guess, than I thought at first, he admitted. But I don't imagine you're married, are you? No, she said and chuckled. Of course not. Not for a long time yet. Fine, he said and laughed also. I'm in no hurry to get married myself. Always figured 30 would be about the right age for me, if I could find a girl to have me by then. Maybe you'd consider waiting that long. I thought I'd wait until I was at least 35, she told him. Better yet, he said approvingly. That would let me put off marrying until I'm about 40. It's a deal. When you're 35, I'll be waiting. Then he sobered abruptly. I hate to leave you here. You won't get scared. I'll be back as soon as I can. I'd leave my dog Savvy, but if anyone saw him here, it would be a dead giveaway that I'd been in your camp. I think I'll send him back to my partner with a note for him to move on to the Cross 7, that I won't be back. I've trained Savvy to go back to the last camp. A smart dog. Takes after his owner, no doubt, Laura added slyly. I'll get you some paper to write that note on, and some oilcloth to wrap it in so it will stay dry. Drinking his coffee, Rip Cambell looked with appreciative eyes at the girl as she climbed briskly into the wagon. A lot of chance any man would have to marry that girl if he waited, he reflected. She'd have dozens of chances to marry. The only way to get her would be to sweep her off her feet and rush her to a preacher quick. Chapter 4. The storm, as it moved over the canyons, brought with it frequent flashes of lightning. Aided by them, Rip traveled steadily along the road to the Gray ranches, across a rolling pine-covered mesa to drop into another of the 7 sister canyons of the Night River. Climbing out of this, the road wound along a narrow ridge where the cliffs fell almost sheer on one side, to descend into a deep gorge that he judged belonged to Dawn Canyon, home of the Grays and neighbor ranchers. Abe had mentioned a narrow, precipitous-walled rock gorge called Gray Gorge. By then, the storm had rumbled away, leaving wispy clouds which allowed enough light for travel at a lope, the clattering of the horse raising an uproar that filled the canyon. Ahead, finally, he saw the first sign of habitation, a light. Closer, he could make out the dim outlines of buildings and corrals, huddled on a bench a little back from the steep-walled trench through which he rode. This must be a ranch of one of the Gray families, and if the Grays were as quick to shoot as the Cross 7 riders, it might be a ticklish matter to ride up to the place. Rip found, however, that riding up to the ranch was not simple. He was halted suddenly by an obstruction, a 10-foot fence of poles and wire stretched between the cliff walls. There was no gate that he could discover. Half a dozen dogs had started a furious barking above him. He raised his voice in a hail that was drowned out by the animals. After repeated shouts, he was answered by a mellow hello which floated from some point below the house. "You Grays," he shouted. "I want to come up and talk to you. I've got word for you." "Come up, but come alone," came the reply. "You can get through on the left. We'll open up for you." The dogs were called off, and a small section of the fence next to the cliff lifted, leaving a space wide enough for a horse and rider to pass through. Some mechanical device, Rip guessed, operated by a rope or wire from a distance. After he had ridden through, the gate dropped again with an ominous clatter. He was still in a rocky trough, some 30 feet deep. "What do you want, and who are you?" demanded the mellow voice coming from the top of the cliff. "I've brought news of a young fellow named Tom Gray, and I've come to ask about a man named Cambell. Myself, I'm a stranger here, Rip Cambell. I came to this country to buy horses. All right. Leave your horse and walk on up to the house. You'll find a foot trail a little to your left. He found it, a series of steep steps, and dismounting climbed to it to follow a path toward the lighted house. As he approached the building, a door opened and a man appeared and invited him to enter. Inside, he found himself in a comfortable, well-furnished ranch house. The rancher was a tall, oldish fellow, long-faced, with a bushy mustache the shade of bright wheat straw and mild blue eyes. Two men had followed Rip up the path and now came into the house. They were young fellows resembling Tom Gray, either his younger brothers or cousins, Rip guessed. "You have news of Tom, you said," remarked the older man. "Yes. He met some rider tonight on the rim of Dust Canyon, not far from the Cross 7, got shot," Rip said briefly. "I heard the shooting and found him lying there with a hole drilled in him just below his shoulder. We put him in a shelter off the road and looked after him as well as we could." The older man shook his head. "Shot, is he? I'm his father, Clayton Gray. These are his brothers, Ed and Lee. The four of us batch here together. Where did you say he was?" Rip detailed the location more fully and explained how he had found the wounded man and, with the help of Laura Cambell, got him to shelter. And he told also that Dale Cambell had headed the previous day for the Gray Ranch to hunt for his stray horses. "Cambell never arrived," said Clayton Gray. "I'm afraid that what happened to Tom may have happened to him. Those Cross 7 gunmen that Carter and Tucker have hired shoot on sight anyone not belonging to their outfit. But I can't understand what Tom was doing over on the Cross 7 tonight. He knew how dangerous it was to travel over there. But come in the kitchen, we'll have some coffee. Ed, you ride up and bring down your uncle. He's my brother and a doctor," he explained to Rip. In the kitchen, Lee Gray made fresh coffee, warmed meat, and biscuits. Rip ate and told of the deal to buy horses from Fred Carter, omitting, however, any mention that the $1,000 earnest money had been furnished by Margaret McNabb living at the Cross 7. "I can't understand what got into Tom to go over in the Cross 7 neighborhood," Clayton Gray remarked again. "Did he say why he rode over there?" "He was out of his head," Rip replied evasively. He surmised that Tom Gray had been riding to the Cross 7 to see Linda Stevens, but it was only a guess, and Tom Gray's private business besides. "What's all this fighting over?" he asked. Gray's face turned bleak. "God knows I don't. I can't understand what happened to Addison Stevens, who ran the Cross 7, until his health broke and his cousin Fred Carter came in. Addison was always friendly and cooperated with us, we Grays, our neighbors the Neals and McQuarters. We were all developing in these canyons of the night what we think is the finest strain of Western cow horse, rock and mountain horses. It was Addison's idea to cross Morgan's with steel dust strains to develop a cow horse that had a world of bottom and spirit, but wouldn't go crazy when roping like thoroughbreds do. I've seen some horses out of this country, stated Rip. They were good ones. We've got hundreds of them, enough to make us all rich if we'd gather them and break them. All of us got along in here fine, until Addison Stevens suffered a breakdown in health, and the Cross 7 went downhill. Addison practically owned the ranch, except for a little stock owned by his half-brother Hamlin. He borrowed money from Jim Coulter, the Hurley saloonman gambler, and sold an interest in the ranch to his cousin Fred Carter, who's one of these polo-playing sportsmen that think they know all about horses. Shortly after that, Addison Stevens seemed to go plumb out of his head, accused us of wanting to kill him, claimed that some of us had taken pot shots at him. We couldn't make him believe otherwise, and then one day we found Addison with my nephew, Zane Gray, and one of the Neal boys, all three shot dead, evidently in a terrible gunfight. Since then, there's been open war between us and the Cross 7. Clayton Gray got up and poured himself another cup of coffee. No telling where it will stop. And Tom shot tonight. He shook his head. They've gone crazy, that's what, he went on. The whole Stevens family. A streak of insanity runs through the whole outfit. Addison's half-brother, Hamlin, has showed it all his life. Always was an excessive drinker. My brother had to treat him after the big sprees he used to go on. If Hamlin hadn't been born in a wealthy family, he'd have been put in an asylum long ago. Lately, Fred Carter and his wife have said that they feared Linda, Addison's daughter, would go insane sometime, that she was already showing signs of it. They've brought out a nurse from the coast to look after her. I'd say that we're living next to an insane asylum, one that has money to hire gunmen. Fred Carter is keeping up the feud? Asked Rip. Keeping it up. More than that. He's had his manager, George Tucker, hire a bunch of gunslingers as riders. Carter is an ambitious sort. I think he wants this whole country and its horses for himself and is trying to drive us out. The Cross 7 claims we've shot 5 of their men. That's a plain lie. Seems to me, remarked Rip, all this is something for a sheriff to stop. Gray snorted. The sheriff? That gambler, Coulter, is strong enough in politics to keep the sheriff on the side of the Cross 7. Someone rode up to the house, and Ed, who had gone after his uncle, came in. Uncle Will is up at the Sam Neill's, he reported. They've ridden to fetch him, but it'll be an hour or two before he gets here. Rip got to his feet. I'd better be riding back then without waiting for you, he told Clayton Gray. That Carvel girl is alone over there. You can come with your brother. We'll look after Tom until you come. I've told you where to find the wagon. I'd send one of the boys with you, offered Gray, but the fewer of us in that country the better. Brother Will and I will get there as soon as we can, and the boys will make a search from this end for Carvel. Rip nodded. Back through the fence closing the gorge, he shoved his horse hard. The first gray light of dawn was sifting into the canyons when he climbed finally to the mesa where he had left Laura Carvel. He used the last strength in the horse, spurring hard over the mesa, turning off the road at last to head for the wagon. He smelled the smoke of the fire before he saw the wagon cover through the trees. Nearer, he saw someone across the campfire, not one person but 2. One was the girl, her back against a high wagon wheel, holding a quirt. Back to Rip was a tall puncher, feinting to get in past the whip. The man's laughter came to Rip as he rode, an evil sort that sent a flood of primitive rage into Rip. He rode straight in, yelling, in his savage rage, forgetting the carbine in a saddle scabbard the Grays had lent him. The man, who was a black-bearded, rangy giant, swung instantly. Seeing the rider, he dropped a hand to draw the 6-shooter from his belt holster. Behind him, Laura Carvel flashed in to catch the man's forearm, an act that maybe saved Rip from being dumped from the saddle, as he continued to ride in, possessed with a crazy desire to deal bare-handed with the black-bearded brute. Roaring with anger, the man, who was the Hale that had held Laura captive at the attack on Dale Carvel, shook off the girl's grip. He was too late, however, to fire the 6-shooter. Rip had thrown himself from his saddle, catapulting himself at the stranger as one would bulldog a steer. His 180 pounds hit Hale full tilt, sent the man to the ground with Rip on top. Hale's 6-shooter exploded harmlessly, just before it flew from his hand to fall close to the wagon tongue. For a second both lay still, a little dazed by the fall. Rip was the first to get up, but he had only reached his knees when Hale leaped at him like a cougar, bearing him to the ground again, this time with Rip underneath. Rip twisted himself away, and rolling out of reach, got to his feet. Hale was up like a rubber ball also, to dive for the fallen 6-shooter. Too late, Laura Carvel, who had stood petrified, rushed forward to try to kick it out of his reach. Hale had it, and with a wolfish growl swung it about just as Rip, diving some 6 feet through the air, struck Hale with his shoulder. Hale crashed down, but this time he held the gun. He could not use it, however. Rip, clamping Hale's forearm, bent it back until he yelped with pain. The man held to the weapon like grim death, and Rip lowered his hold to Hale's wrist and gun barrel. Slowly, he put pressure on the wrist, while Hale twisted and fought furiously to free his hand. There ensued a grim, silent struggle between the pair for the weapon, with the younger, Rip, proving to have the superior strength. Using the leverage of his long arms, he succeeded in turning the barrel toward Hale's side. "Quit," he ordered, "or you'll shoot yourself." "Damn you," the man grunted and again tried savagely to wrench the gun away. The weapon was so fixed that the hammer fired without the trigger being pulled, and the hammer had lifted during the struggle. The gun exploded suddenly, sending a shot tunneling upward into Hale's chest, shattering his heart. The man shuddered and then straightened out to lie inert, every muscle relaxed. Rip got up, breathing hard, holding the six-shooter, staring down at the dead man. As he stood, he swayed a little, and Laura Carvel, thinking he was about to collapse, put her arm about him. "I'm all right," he told her. "Except that I killed a man. I hoped I never would have to do that." "He killed himself," disagreed the girl. "I'm witness to that. You asked him to quit, but he wouldn't. And that's the man who shot Tom Gray last night. His name is Hale. He works for the Cross 7. Rip looked at the man's boots. They would leave tracks about the size of those left by the man who had ambushed him and Abe Perkins in camp. "After shooting Gray last night," the girl went on, "he was afraid to risk finishing him in the dark. He went to the ranch and came back this morning to find out what had become of Gray. While hunting him, he came into camp here. He caught me and began kissing me. I broke loose, then he came at me again." "I'm not sorry I killed him," interrupted Rip grimly. "It was a plumb pleasure. I'd like to do it over again. Him putting his hands on you. His arm went about the girl. "You're the bravest girl I ever knew, Laura. To think that but let's forget him. I reached the Grays all right, but your dad hadn't shown up there. Tom's father and his uncle doctor will be here soon, and if there's no word of your father by that time, I'll look for him with the help of my hound. How's Gray been?" She looked in the direction of the shelter containing the wounded man. "He's worse. A lot worse. I'll have to go back to look after him. Supposing I spell you out while you cook a breakfast here. There's something else I've got to do too." He nodded at Hale's body. "Bury him and his saddle, and turn his horse loose, hoping it won't go back to the Cross 7 headquarters. The horse is only a half-broke bronc, and the chances are he'll head for the range where he was foaled. If he goes back to the ranch, they might backtrack him here, unless the rain starts again. Which it's going to do. Those clouds mean business. I hate to bury a man without benefit of coroner and preacher, but it's the only way to make Gray safe and ourselves." She nodded. "Go ahead. I can testify later how he ended. We'll never get out of here ourselves, unless we're as hard as men like Hale." She brought 2 shovels from the wagon. "I'll help you," she added practically. "No," he vetoed that. "You've seen too much already for a girl. You get busy on breakfast." In an hour, Rip had a grave dug and filled, and hidden under the pine needles. Rain had started to fall again, a slashing downpour. He had looked in on Tom Gray every few minutes. The boy was in a bad way, no doubt about it. He ate a hurried breakfast with Laura. They had just finished when someone called from the brush not far from the wagon. Back in the trees, Rip found Clayton Gray and his doctor brother Will. Rip took them at once to the shelter where the doctor made a careful examination of his nephew. Chapter 5. The doctor rancher, Will Gray, took his nephew's pulse and temperature, then shook his head. "Tom can't be moved far," he declared flatly. I can clean out that wound and give him enough opiate to put him to sleep. But he'd never live halfway to Don Canyon if we tried to move him now by horseback. The jarring would reopen that hole, and he'd bleed to death. The best we could do is to take him over part way by stretcher and the rest of the way in a rig at night, but I couldn't recommend even that for a couple of days. But if we leave him here, argued Clayton Gray, he's in danger of being tracked down and shot by these Cross-7 hounds. I don't think he'll be tracked down after these rains, stated Rip. They may not even know anyone was shot last night. The man who shot him, Hale, came back here this morning to hunt for Tom. It's just possible Hale might not have told anyone of the fight. And Hale sure won't tell anyone now. Briefly, he told the Grays of his encounter with Hale. Dr. Gray nodded. It's at least safer to leave Tom here than to try to move him on a horse. Leaving him in enemy country is bad enough, but it gives him a chance at least. Taking him away now means he'd have none. If he's got to stay, he'll have to stay, said Clayton Gray resignedly. I'll be here with him, of course. You tell me how to take care of him. I'd stay myself if I could, said the doctor. But with Mrs. Sam Neill expecting a baby, I've got to go back. And I couldn't do Tom much good by staying here. Keep his fever down. Give him little to eat, that's all we can do. I'll clean out this wound, and we'll hope that he dodges blood poisoning and pneumonia. Then I'll be starting back, and plan to get here again tonight to see him. Hastily, Dr. Gray worked with the patient, after which he rode away, taking a little used trail to return to Don Canyon. Laura Carvel, who had stationed herself on a little rocky pinnacle near the wagon to keep watch, hurried to the shelter to give warning that a group of riders, a dozen or so, had come up the road leading from the bottom of Dusk Canyon. Tucker, the Cross-7 manager, was leading them. This brought a fresh complication. Rip went back with the girl to the pinnacle. Through the rain, they saw that all the riders except two were spreading out through the timber near the head of the side canyon, evidently to make a search. So Hale had told the Cross-7 that he had shot someone, and Tucker had brought men to hunt the wounded man. Two of the party had caught sight of the wagon cover, evidently, for they were coming through the trees toward the Carvel camp. Laura identified one of these as Tucker, the other Rip recognized as Fred Carter. Keep cool, Rip told the girl. There's been enough rain to cover the tracks of Hale's horse to your wagon. Tell them you haven't seen him, but maybe heard a horse off in the brush this morning. And you heard no shots last night. Rip hid in a dense thicket of brush close to the wagon, judging it best that he not be seen in the Carvel camp. Tucker and Carter pulled up near the wagon to find Laura washing breakfast dishes, only one set. Your father, where is he? Demanded Tucker, harshly. I gave him orders to travel straight on to the Grays. The road was so bad that we couldn't take the wagon along it, returned the girl spiritedly. Dad left by horseback yesterday to go to the Grays. He was to come back last night, but he didn't. Fred Carter, whose pale blue eyes had been admiring Laura Carvel's pretty face and slim figure, pushed himself into the talk. So you're the girl who came in here hunting stray horses, he said with a gallant sweep of his hat. And your father rode to the Grays and hasn't returned. It's easy to guess what's become of him in that case. Too easy, he went on with a show of deep regret. He ran into some of these Gray killers, and they shot him, just as they shot my cousin and 5 of our riders. My name is Carter, I run the Cross-7. May I offer you my sympathy and protection? And may I suggest that you come to the Cross-7 to stay with us until we have definite word of your father. Meanwhile, I'll do what we can to find your father. I'm afraid, however, he added with a shake of his head, that I can't offer too much hope. There seemed but one thing to say to Carter's offer. Laura had to thank the man, although she realized what lay behind his pretended solicitude. Carter, plainly was a lady killer. Laura had known a few of his sort. We were told that one of the Grays rode over here last night and was shot by one of our men, Carter went on. There must have been a shooting scrape not far from here, near enough for you to have heard the shots. I'm a sound sleeper, the girl said evasively. You should have heard the shots, repeated Carter, if there was any shooting. Maybe there was no shooting at all. Tucker, I think Hale might have been lying. He said he was coming back here early to see if he could find the man he'd shot. He's not here now. You didn't see him, Miss Carvell. Laura hesitated. I did think I heard a horse off in the brush this morning, she said. But I could have been mistaken. 10-1 Hale was spinning us a wild yarn, Carter said to Tucker. He claimed he recognized Tom Gray. But what would Tom Gray be doing over here? Someone from the Grays has been close to the ranch house several times in the last couple of weeks, stated Tucker. Twice I followed the tracks of a horse back to Gray Gorge. Fuming, Tucker glanced about the timber and at the rocky rampart in which Tom Gray lay. I say Hale wasn't lying. He did shoot somebody. But what's become of Hale? All this don't look good to me. If Tom Gray was wounded and set afoot like Hale said, he's likely hiding somewhere around here. I'm going to have this mesa hunted over foot by foot. We'll locate him if it takes us all day. Tucker's voice held a stubborn determination. Laura realized that he meant what he said. Her heart beat fast. Tom Gray and his father were certain to be discovered. The sky was clearing a little, and the rain changing to a drizzle. If Tucker kept his men circling here, combing the country thoroughly, they would be sure to come to the shelter. And that meant a gun battle, which would end in both Grays being slaughtered. A desperate chance had to be taken to get them out of that danger. Laura smiled at Fred Carter. A plan had flashed into her mind. I think if you don't mind, she said, I'll move my wagon near your ranch this morning, Mr. Carter, and camp there until my father has been found. Fred Carter positively beamed approval of this. Certainly, he said. You're welcome to do that. But you don't have to camp. You'll be more than welcome as a guest in our house. My wife will be glad to have you, he added. He glanced over Laura's head and frowned suddenly. Why, there's Linda, he exclaimed. Followed us up here in this rain. What got into her? Laura turned also and saw the girl who had saved her father from a quirt riding toward the wagon. This morning, Linda had discarded her side saddle and riding habit for a man's shirt, slicker, and stock saddle. Laura noticed as the girl pulled up near the wagon that the pale face was tense, drawn, and the eyes were red as if from weeping. Laura promptly poured a cup of steaming coffee and took it to the girl. Linda Stevens took it with a trembling hand. Fred Carter and Tucker had withdrawn a little distance to talk, which gave Laura her chance. She signaled to the girl to move her horse a few paces, so that both she and Linda would be only a few feet from Rip Cambell's hiding place, so close that he could overhear their talk. You know Tom Gray? Laura asked directly. The girl stared at her in wide-eyed surprise. I know him, yes, she admitted hesitantly. I knew him years ago. He and his brothers came to our ranch to attend school. You don't hate him? The girl's fingers tightened on the handle of the cup. No, I don't hate him, she said huskily. But how do you know about Tom? You have seen him. Tell me what happened. You're willing to help him? Persisted Laura. Yes, anything. Believe me, I'd do anything for him. I have to listen to Tucker and Carter and the rest talk of murdering the Grays, but I love Tom. He's been coming to the ranch secretly to see me, although each trip has meant risking his life. He was to come last night, but he didn't. Something happened to him. At the ranch this morning, I heard that Hale claimed to have shot one of the Grays. Tom, he thought. Tell me what happened. Hale did shoot Tom Gray. Shot him from his saddle, but he's still alive. We've been taking care of him. He's not far away from here now. Too close to be safe. Tucker is hunting this mesa, and he'll be found, sure. There's no time to lose. He needs your help. The soul of the girl was revealed in the sudden illumination that came to her face. I'll do anything, she repeated. What can I do? Tell me. Laura's voice became matter-of-fact, casual. You've got to calm yourself first. I'm going to hitch up the team to the wagon and move down canyon to be near your ranch. I want you to ride into the rocks where you see those two dead pines leaning against each other. A few yards west of there, you'll find Tom Gray and his father. You must tell his father it's necessary to move his son at once, and the only way to do that is to get him to the wagon. There's a stretcher in the shelter that can be used to bring him here. Once here, we can hide him in the back. I'll drive close to the Cross 7 headquarters. Tom can stand only a short trip, otherwise I'd take him to Hurley. Do you understand? Linda Stevens nodded. Yes. Bring him to the ranch. We'll find a place to hide him there in the cliffs. Tucker had ridden away to join his men, but Carter was lingering near the wagon. When you come back, Laura went on, you've got to get Carter away from here without making him suspicious. After the girl had ridden into the trees, Laura hurried to get the Gray team harnessed. Rip Cambell, she knew, would follow Linda Stevens to the shelter and help Gray move his son. Laura found herself working in a frenzy of haste, with her fingers all thumbs. Then she suddenly got hold of herself. A man's life, no, the lives of 3 men, Rip, Tom, and Tom Gray's father, were at stake. With the team hooked to the wagon, she loaded up the camp gear, spreading her bed in the back for Tom Gray. When she began work, Fred Carter lazily sat his horse nearby, chatting, plainly liking to talk with a pretty young stranger. But when Linda Stevens returned, she soon disposed of Carter, challenging him to hurdle some fallen trees. Carter preferred showing off his riding skill, of which he was plainly proud, even to talking to Laura. Little by little, by inducing Carter to race his horse against hers, Linda got Carter out of sight of the wagon. Laura stood guard while Rip and Clayton Gray brought the wounded man from the brush to load him into the vehicle. Then Rip went back for the bed and tarpaulin, while Gray crawled in beside his son. It will be a hard ride for him, Laura said. It's not far to the Cross 7, said Clayton Gray. They'll never think to look for Tom there. It was a smart idea you had. We'll get him away as soon as we can, though, if we have to carry him every foot on a stretcher. I'm afraid to trust the Stevens girl with a secret like this. She may mean well toward Tom, but she's got an insane streak in her, same as the rest of the family. Laura went into the brush to meet Rip, who had brought the bedroll. Placed in the back of the wagon, it would serve as a screen for the Grays. Rip looked at her. You're a smart, brave girl, he told her warmly. I'm riding out now, taking Clayton Gray's horse with me to turn loose. It won't do to have him found around here. Then I'm riding to meet my partner. Want to get my hound to help hunt for your father. It's rained too much for a dog to find old trails, but savvy he's not an ordinary dog. I'd like something your father has worn. There's an old soft leather pair of shoes he wears around camp, she said. I'll get one of them. Fine. If he's afoot and wandering about, Savvy can cut his trail in a hurry. I'll see you at the Cross 7 tonight, and I'll hope to have good news for you. Laura forgot the ledger and worry for a moment, looking at Rip Cambell. You'll be running the risk of being shot yourself, she told him. All this is shooting country. Be careful. You be careful, he ordered. You're taking a lot of chances yourself, doing this for Tom Carey. He grinned. The more I see of you, the more willing I am to wait for you until I'm 40. But only if I have to, he added. A little later, she sat in the front of the wagon. She spoke to the team, and the Grays moved out. Chapter 6. The wagon, following the road down the side canyon, bumped terribly as its steel-rimmed wheels hammered over stones. Laura flinched with each jar, as if she were the wounded man in the back. Behind her, Tom Gray occasionally broke out into a delirious mutter, which his father tried to quiet. Reaching Dusk Canyon, they turned down it toward the Cross 7 headquarters. They had traveled a little over a mile along this when a rider galloped up alongside the wagon, Linda Stevens, who had managed to leave Fred Carter behind. Laura stopped the wagon. "He's all right?" Linda asked anxiously. Tom Gray's father was looking over Laura's shoulder at the rider with so forbidding a face that Linda Stevens shivered. "And what is it to you how he is?" Gray growled. "She had nothing to do with Tom being shot." Laura put in sharply, feeling pity for the pale-faced girl. "There is no blame to her for the shooting," Gray was forced to admit. "But her relatives are responsible. And I promise you, Miss Stevens, we'll get Tom away from the Cross 7 neighborhood tonight, if it's possible." "There is no need to hurry him away," protested Linda. "You mustn't move him until he's well enough." Gray's face was stern. "That is for us to judge," he declared. "There is no safety for him near the Cross 7 ranch, any more than if we were in a nest of—" Evidently, he had intended to say rattlesnakes, but he did not finish. The wagon rumbled on again, with Linda Stevens riding a little ahead. The canyon was widening now. On the left were slopes covered thickly with pines, on the right rose sheer cliffs. Now the ranch came in sight, lying in the wide cleft made by a side canyon. Below, near the creek, were the corrals, sheds, stables, and a bunkhouse, the latter built of thin slabs of red rock. Several hundred yards above sat the ranch house. It sprawled under a huge wedge of wall, a big rock dwelling built in some respects like an English castle, with little towers, and the side walls extended above the roof in a parapet which was cut with slits designed in the old days for the use of archers. The walls had been built of thin rock laid by expert workmen. Shrubs, trees, and stretches of green lawn lay in terraces in front and at the side of the house. It all looked like a pretentious city mansion, and was as out of place in this country as a herd of giraffes or zebras. Behind the house lifted cliffs of blood-red color, the kind of red that is somber and gloomy, with a few piñons and junipers that did little to soften the somber walls. In places, the cliffs mounted in sheets of solid rock, like curtains hung from the rims to the canyon floor. In other places, they had been weathered into towers, obelisks, various-shaped domes, and cubes. Linda Stevens pointed to a break in the cliff a quarter of a mile or so further on, and about the same distance from the ranch. "There's a good place to camp," she remarked. "I played in there as a child. We children had a secret house back under the cliff in a thicket." Laura stopped the team when they reached the place Linda had pointed out. Clumps of thick brush choked the entrance to the little break in the cliff walls. The wagon could be so drawn up that Tom Gray could be carried from it directly into the brush. She looked back inquiringly at Gray, and when he nodded his approval, she guided the team into the open space, halting the wagon so that the back of it was close to the thicket. Then she got down to follow Gray, who had slipped out to enter the brushy covert, through growth so thick that they had to force their way through it. 30 yards or so, and they found the remains of an old playhouse. From a low-branched tree nearby, a tarpaulin could be rigged to make a shelter tent. While Linda acted as lookout, in case anyone should ride up, Gray and Laura got the wounded man back through the brush with difficulty. After that, Laura gathered wood and built a fire near the wagon. Linda Stevens would have stayed, but she realized that she could be of no help, and she was only disturbing Tom's father by being there. Reluctantly, she went back to the ranch while Laura made a broth for the wounded man from fresh meat she and her father had brought with them. Abe Perkins came along shortly, leading 2 pack horses. Rip had met him, he told Laura, and had saddled a horse and ridden out with Savvy to hunt for Dale Carvel. Abe brought Laura's saddle, hidden in a bedroll. "Just leave it to Rip," Abe assured her. "Believe it or not, but Rip's just got an instinct for finding critters. He can just size up a country and seem to know where to look for what he's huntin', bear or cougar or horses or cattle. While that dog Savvy has got the high-poweredest nose I ever seen in a dog. They make a pair, those two. They found a dead man one time, after the country had been gone over inch by inch. Of course," he added hastily, "your pa ain't dead. He'll turn up alive." Laura tried to believe that, but it was hard. If her father had met with an accident, it seemed an impossible task for a man and a dog to find him in a strange country, where rain had certainly washed out all tracks. And yet she had faith in that young fellow, who seemed somehow to be part of the canyons, the trees, the mountain peaks. He reminded her of the stories she had heard of the fur trappers, the buckskin-clad men who had wandered easily into every corner of the unexplored West, often through hostile Indian tribes. In the strange, insane world of the mighty canyons into which she and her father had traveled, where cruelty and murder ruled, Rip Cambell was a stalwart refuge. The day dragged by. Abe Perkins wandered up to the Cross 7 and was gone for several hours. Clayton Gray watched by the side of his son. Laura dozed a little and came to with a start. The skies were clouded again, rain was falling on distant peaks. Standing not 10 feet from her was a man of medium height, rather chunky, with a sharp-featured face and dark prominent eyes that shone with a malicious delight. He was dressed in slovenly fashion, but carried an expensive hunting rifle. Laura was frightened. There was something terrifying about the man, although he smiled at her. "Have no fear," he said. "It is only Hamlin Stevens, completely and entirely harmless. And you're the little girl whose father has been lost." He made a clucking noise of sympathy, and then smiled again. This, she realized, must be Linda Stevens' uncle, her father's half-brother. While she looked at him fearfully, the man suddenly wheeled, galvanized into action. Bringing his rifle to his shoulder, he pumped all the shots in the magazine, apparently at a blank spot, the cliff opposite. Then, chuckling to himself, he strolled on. She waited a little, and then went back to reassure Gray about the shooting. "Hamlin Stevens is crazy," he growled. "Raving mad. Oughtn't to be allowed to carry a gun. A no-good that all but drank himself to death when he was young. A wastrel, never did a day's work in his life. Traveled back and forth to Europe until his inheritance was all used up." The shots had brought Linda Stevens hurrying down to camp afoot. She was shaking with fear, believing that Tom Gray had been found. From the ever-ready coffee pot, Laura poured a cup of hot liquid for her while she explained the firing. "Uncle Hamlin should be in an asylum, everyone says," stated Linda. "My father got him out of plenty of scrapes. He's never been responsible. Both my uncle and I would be far better off dead, like Dad," she went on bitterly. "We're no good to the world. But I should keep such talk to myself. You have your own troubles with your father missing," she reproached herself. "Dad's all right," said Laura with a confidence she was far from feeling. "Anyway, I'll believe that he's all right until I have word that he isn't. What good is there in worrying until then?" "None," admitted Linda. "But you have nothing to blame yourself for. With me, it's different. My caring for someone resulted in his getting shot. His family hates all of us at the Cross 7, and I don't blame them. And I can't be of much help to him now when he's in trouble. I couldn't even save his life if they were to find him." Her tone changed. "I want to ask you, Laura, to come up to the ranch for supper tonight. Aunt Erica insists on calling it dinner out here on a ranch. Fred Carter suggested that I ask you." And I want you to meet Nab, my nurse when I was a child. Abe Perkins knew her when he worked here years ago. He's been up there talking to her for hours." Laura hesitated. She did not trust Fred Carter, and the further she kept from him, the better. George Tucker was a merciless brute, but she felt safer with him than with Carter. She did not want to go to the ranch, but she could not refuse Linda's invitation. Linda waited while Laura got ready to go to the house, and together the two girls walked down the canyon to head for the grassy terraces below the house. As they passed through a gate in a high, carefully trimmed hedge, they came upon a tall, sleek-haired woman cutting flowers from a little garden plot. "Aunt Erica," said Linda, "this is Laura Carvel." Erica Carter, a tight-mouthed woman who looked older than her husband, looked at Laura from cold eyes. She nodded slightly, dismissing Laura as of no consequence. An older woman had appeared, tall, raw-boned. This was Margaret McNabb, who had been Linda's childhood nurse. She was a thin, angular woman, with hair so colorless and unattractive it could not have been helped by anything except a wig. She bunched it up carelessly and let it go at that. She had long, bony hands and a voice as rough as a rasp. Despite all this, Laura liked the woman at once. She was plainly so blunt, honest, and good-hearted. The three went into one wing of the big house, where a living room and 2 bedrooms made Linda's suite of rooms. Nab settled down to knitting, making her needles click. "If you take my advice, both of you," she said in her mannish voice, "you girls will both get out of here. Take 2 horses and hightail it tonight and keep riding until you are out of the country. It's madness to stay here." "It's madness," agreed Linda Stevens despondently. "That's just it, madness." Nab laid down her knitting needles. "Linda thinks," she told Laura, "that she's losing her mind, going insane. She thinks it runs in the family. That's what the Carters say, but I say they're wrong. They claim her pa went crazy and got in a quarrel with the Grays and started all this war. I say it's nonsense. Her Uncle Hamlin is sort of crazy, but only from booze. And anyway, he's only her father's half-brother. Uncle Hamlin says it runs back in the family for generations," said the girl dully. "He says that's why he first started drinking, knowing he couldn't marry with the chance of having his children tainted by insanity. The Carters are right. I feel that I am losing my mind." "I've got something to tell you, Linda," said Nab. "Those men in here, Abe Perkins and that fellow he brought with him, they're here to help you. They're not here to buy horses. I asked Abe to come in here to help you. I sent him $1,000 so they could come in here and deal for horses with Fred Carter. And I wouldn't have done that if I thought anything was wrong with your mind, Linda." "Why, Nab?" exclaimed Linda and hugged the woman hard. "You were foolish to use your money for that. And I once even thought you'd turned against me, that you were looking after me because you thought I was going insane. That's how I got the Carters to let me come here," Nab explained to Laura. "They were to pay me a lot of money to testify when a hearing is held to decide if Linda is what they call mentally competent or not. They're the worst people I ever saw, those two, deliberately trying to ruin a young girl's life by getting her declared insane when it's all nonsense." Across the court, a door was thrown violently open, and Hamlin Stevens emerged in his shirt sleeves, wearing flapping slippers, carrying the hunting rifle. He raised the weapon and emptied it at a canyon wall. Then, reloading in a frenzy of haste, he emptied the gun again. Linda walked out into the court to take the man's arm and, talking to him soothingly, conducted him back to his quarters. "Hamlin busts out that crazy way about every so often," said Nab quietly. "But it's only natural after all the whiskey he's downed. As a nurse, I've seen a lot of whiskey-swillin' hogs, but never one to compare with him." A gong summoned them to dinner, and when Linda returned, The three went into a hall-like room where a stingy fire burned cheerlessly in a huge fireplace. Fred Carter and his wife appeared, Carter to rush forward to try to take Laura's hands. She dodged him, aware of the glinting eyes of Erica Carter. They ate in a dining room, which wouldn't have been much larger in a real castle, with heavy oak beams and paneled walls of dark wood. It was a dreary sort of meal, with only candles for light and a bald Chinaman serving. Fred Carter tried to make light talk with compliments to Laura, and his light blue eyes never left her. Hamlin Stevens came in to take a place when they were about through. He did not eat. He only stared around the table at everybody from his bugged-out eyes, chuckling to himself occasionally. Linda was the only one who tried to talk to him, but he paid no attention to what she said. Finally, with a sharp, sarcastic, "Excuse me," he got up quickly and disappeared. Finished with the meal, the others went back into the hall-like room. "I'll have to start back," said Laura, wanting desperately to leave. "Nab and I will walk down to your camp with you," Linda offered. "Do you think it's safe for you to go out at night, Linda?" asked Erica Carter. "Some of these gray killers may be lurking around, waiting to kill you as they killed your father." "I'm not afraid of the Grays, and I don't believe they killed Father," stated Linda, in a sudden flash of spirit. "They're not killers." Both the Carters gazed at Linda, and in the silence, a pin dropped on the tile in front of the fireplace would have sounded as loud as a shot. "Then, you don't know what you are saying," said Erica Carter in a sudden rage. "Defending your father's murderers." Linda Stevens had shown spirit against Tucker in compelling the release of Dale Carvel, but now the flash of independence died swiftly, and she seemed only to cower. "No, I don't know what I'm saying," she admitted tonelessly. "We will forget what you said," said Erica Carter. "We know you are afraid, that these dark canyons terrify you. You must not forget what happened to your father, and you must hate these people who murdered him. They are your enemies," the woman went on in her hard, smooth voice. "And we must be careful, dear, not to let fear get the best of us. Fear in your case is fatal. You know what it will lead to. You know your weakness. You must guard yourself." "Yes, Aunt Erica," said the girl meekly. "As for you, child," Fred Carter said to Laura, "I think you'd better stay here in the house, it's safer. Those horse buyers, we don't know anything about them, and they are camped not far from you. I think you should stay here at the house where we can look after you." "I'd prefer to be in camp," Laura said calmly. Carter glared at his wife, evidently blaming her for the girl's refusal to stay in the ranch house. "Tomorrow we'll see what we can do in trying to find your father, my dear," he promised, and took one of her hands. Laura withdrew it and shivered. More and more, she disliked and feared this Carter. Back at the Carvel wagon, Linda Stevens asked to see Tom Gray, if only for a moment. The wounded man was breathing hard, tossing about restlessly, muttering deliriously. Linda came back to the wagon with tears in her eyes. Nab, as a nurse, went to look at him and make fresh bandages for him. Then the two women returned to the ranch. Abe Perkins wandered down to Laura's camp. Rip had not yet returned from his search, he reported. Laura could see that the oldish man was worried. Chapter 7. Rip's partner was worried. And with good reason, certainly. Rip was in danger of being shot by both sides in the war raging in the canyons off the Night River. There had been no sign all day of Tucker and the riders that had been making a search on the mesa for Tom Gray. But now the cavalcade of riders came loping down the canyon with a sudden outburst of yells to pull up at the corrals below the ranch house. Lights came on in the bunkhouse. Abe Perkins went in to talk to Clayton Gray, whom Abe had known when he had ridden for the Cross 7. He came out finally, yawning drowsily, and headed for the camp he had made not far from Laura's wagon. The lights in the bunkhouse went out, and the canyon became quiet. With the storm cleared away, the night was still, so still that Laura could hear the occasional restless muttering of Tom Gray. She sat down with her back against a bedroll and dozed a little. And then, as if he had materialized there by magic, Rip was in camp, smiling at Laura over the fire. "Found your dad," he reported. "His leg was broken. His horse had been shot from ambush, but your father managed to get away, dragged himself into some rocks. Likely some Cross-7 man tried to get him. I got him on a horse and took him to the Grays. Doc Gray set his leg, and he's resting easy except that he's worried about you." "You found him," she could only exclaim at first, while relief and gratitude flooded her. "Abe told me you would." "Thanks, Savvy," he said, referring to the black and tan hound. "He ran on to the fresh trails of 3 different mountain lions, but I kept him to the notion he was hunting a man. Finding him was luck mostly, and Savvy. I left Savvy at the Grays. He was footsore. You'd better travel over there tonight and get out of this country." "But I can't do that," she pointed out. "If I went away, the Cross-7 would be sure to find Tom Gray, unless we could take him with us. We can't do that tonight. Doc Gray can't come over tonight. He has to attend a sick neighbor woman. How's Tom been?" "As well as could be expected. Still out of his head. They plan to move him tomorrow night. Doc Gray said it wouldn't be safe any sooner. They're bringing a buckboard tomorrow night to the top of the mesa, and they'll carry him to it by stretcher. You'll leave then, too." "And you?" she asked. "I'm staying here to get some of those Night Canyon horses. They're the finest I've seen anywhere. The country is full of them. Are they worth risking your life for?" "Sure," he said. "Besides, I like this country. I'd like to ranch here in these canyons, trap beaver in the upper streams, and hunt the mountain lions that are killing off colts. This is horse country if I ever saw one." He was looking at her, smiling a little, his eyes glowing. "I always knew it," he said abruptly. "Knew what?" she asked, surprised. "Knew that when I saw a certain face across a campfire, I'd know that face belonged to the girl I'd like to see across my fire always. You fit in with an outdoor fire, Laura." She laughed at that. "You say the queerest things sometimes, Rip Cambell. Who else would ever tell a girl that she fitted in with an outdoor fire? Sounds foolish, I guess, but it's not. Looking across a fire at a girl seems the most natural way to me of looking at a girl. My partner tells me I ought to have been born 60 years ago, so I could have been a trapper. But I like living in a house, a good log house. And I can build one too, I'll have you know. I'm going to build one for the girl I marry. As many rooms in it as she wants. And I'm not joking." "I know you're not, Rip," she said quietly. "And when Dad and I get back to our ranch, you'll come to see us. We've got a big fireplace, and I want to see how you look by the light of it. But that will be when we're all out of these canyons of the night, if we ever are." Rip stepped close to her and put his arm over her shoulders lightly. "Look," he said, "don't you go getting afraid now after it's all over. Tomorrow night you'll be safe and happy with your father over in Dawn Canyon." She was very still for a moment. Then, "But you won't be going with us. You'll be staying here. And will that make a difference to you?" he asked. Her eyes met his. "Yes, it will, Rip." "I like to hear you say that," he told her gravely. His arm tightened about her, drawing her to him. "But I've got to stay here, Laura. Abe and I came in here to help Linda Stevens. Abe's friend, that McNabb woman, paid a lot of money so we could come in." She was silent, her slim figure rigid. "You persuade Linda to leave with you, and I'll go along," said Rip. "Is that a promise?" she demanded swiftly. "It's a promise. It's little to what I'd really do for you, Laura." When you're out of this, I want to tell you just how much I would like to do for you, including that big log house built to your order." He thought of her smile as he went to the camp Abe Perkins had made, and there, near exhaustion from his 2 trips to the Gray Ranch and his long search for Laura's father, he rolled in and slept like a dead man. But he was awake before daylight, joining Abe Perkins, who was up getting breakfast. Abe was in a sober mood. To him, the situation was as dangerous as a family of children playing with a box of dynamite caps. Rip agreed, but had he only himself to worry about, he would have been enjoying the danger. These deep canyons, the horses that ranged on the mesas above, the deadly feud even attracted him. This Cross-7 presented a problem to him, like that of catching some renegade, shrewd old silvertip. Only this situation was one of human minds and human hands that could shoot deadly guns. He had reassured Laura Carvel that the danger was practically over, but he knew it wasn't. For one thing, too many people knew of the presence of the wounded Tom Gray. The girl Linda, in love with the young fellow, might give away the dangerous secret in a dozen ways. "Only thing to do," said Abe, "is to get all these females and Gray out of here tonight. That's a large party to move, without any of these Cross-7 riders finding out about it. No matter. Either we all get out, or else we're all gone goslings. That Carter and Tucker are snake bloods from what Nab told me. If they suspected we ain't in here to buy horses, we'd be in hot water quick." They were eating breakfast when the Cross-7 crew of riders started from the corrals, led by Tucker. Both Rip and Abe put rifles under bedrolls where they could be yanked out quickly, and stuck 6-shooters under their jackets. Tucker rode up to the fire. "I heard you brought in a hound. Is he any good at trailing?" demanded Tucker. "He's got a nose that can smell," said Rip. "But not after these rains. Besides, he's off hunting somewhere now." "Trouble with that hound, he trails the wrong direction sometimes," put in Abe. "Like he started off the wrong way on a turkey trail once, and finally landed back at the eggshells out of which they'd been hatched that spring." This was a favorite, humorous yarn among hunters, but it brought no smile from Tucker. "One of them Grays was up on that mesa night before last," he said harshly. "And Hale shot him out of the saddle. Hale's disappeared, and we haven't been able to find that Gray. It's my idea some people know more about that than they're tellin' and are keeping their mouths shut. I got a hunch someone hid that man from us, and that might be some of you strangers. One thing," he growled, "you'll get no horses from this ranch. We got none to sell." He rejoined his men, and they rode on up the canyon, presumably to take up the hunt again. Abe and Rip looked after the cavalcade. "That feller gives me a chill," commented old Abe. "Sooner we get out of here, the better I'll like it. He suspects us. He may even get around to suspecting we got Tom Gray hid down here, and then there'll be hell to pay in big chunks." The day passed by slowly. Several times, Linda came down with Nab to visit the Carvel camp. They brought news of a heated quarrel between the Carters, ending in Mrs. Carter departing for Hurley in a buckboard driven by one of the ranch hands. The woman often left the ranch after quarreling with her husband, said Nab. Laura suggested that Linda and Nab go to the Grays that night, but the girl replied that she was not wanted by the Grays and had too much pride to force herself on them. There was no changing her mind. Rip had ridden out to pretend to look for Carvel again. During the ride, he was trailed by several of the Cross-7 riders, and he dared not go to the Gray Ranch. Twice during the day, Hamlin Stevens came by with his rifle to send a senseless burst of shots at a bare cliff wall. In the late afternoon, Tucker and the Cross-7 crew returned to the ranch. Rip came in before sunset. Abe Perkins told him what news there was. A half-mile up the canyon, in a brush clump, Abe had discovered a buckboard that had been abandoned with a broken tongue, evidently shoved off the road and forgotten. Abe had spliced the broken tongue and bound it with rawhide strips to make the rig serviceable. It represented a possible way of taking out Tom Gray if it became necessary. It should not be needed, if the Grays arrived as planned, to carry Tom to the top of the mesa where a rig was to be waiting to transport him the rest of the way home. The sun set, leaving a clear sky. Rip would have preferred a clouded one. There were a lot of men working for the Cross 7. Abe said he had counted nearly 20. Just after sunset, several more came in from the direction of Hurley. Some more recruits for the Cross 7 army, Abe remarked. According to the plan, the Grays were due to arrive an hour or so before midnight. Twilight came. Rip regretted that they had not set an earlier hour. He scented danger. There was a lot of restless activity at the Cross 7 corrals. Down canyon, men came from the bunkhouse to go to the corrals to saddle. A dozen men, led by Tucker, raced up the canyon to pull in suddenly by the campfire where Abe Perkins and Rip were cooking supper. The riders gathered in a semicircle about the two. "I told you birds," said Tucker, "that you aren't getting any horses from this ranch. So get out now." "Now?" said Abe, startled. That meant the end of their plan to take Laura Carvel, Linda Stevens, and Nab out of the country, and to help Tom Gray get back home. "Now," repeated Tucker harshly. "Get your horses packed and pull your freight." "How about the $1,000 we paid as earnest money to Carter?" inquired Rip. "Talk to him about that," growled Tucker. "We don't want you in this country, that's all." "Talking to Carter is just what we'll do," said Rip promptly. "Yeah, we demand to see Fred Carter," said Abe Perkins. "We made a deal with him, and he's running this ranch." "He just thinks he's running it," stated Tucker. "You two are getting off the range and doing it quick. You're not talking to Carter, you're leaving. We don't want strangers in here. We don't know if you belong to the Gray tribe or not, but some queer things have happened since you come in. One being that our man Hale has never showed up, and we found his horse running loose without his saddle and bridle." "But," argued Perkins, "we paid $1,000 down, and we're entitled to take out at least a few head of horses. It wouldn't take a day to get the 10 head we paid for." "No," said Tucker, raising his voice almost to a shout. "Get your loads on your pack horses and get ready to travel. I'm sending some men with you to see that you go to Hurley. They'll take you down the Night River by a shortcut." There was nothing that they could do. They couldn't fight nearly a dozen men who were plainly prepared to go into action at a word from Tucker. Abe Perkins shrugged. "Looks like we got our tickets bought for the train, and the conductor is yelling all aboard," he remarked. Silently, he and Rip cinched pack saddles on their 2 horses and loaded them, throwing diamond hitches over topping bedrolls while Tucker's party watched. Then, satisfied, Tucker turned to go back to the ranch. "One final thing," he said. "Don't you come back in here, you two, whatever you do." Rip caught half grins on the faces of several of the men at this remark. He guessed the reason for their amusement. With 4 men riding behind them, he and Abe started out, each leading a packed horse. Laura Carvel was waiting by the wagon, and Rip pulled up to talk to her while Abe arranged his mount and pack horse to keep their escort of 4 men back out of earshot. "Don't worry," Rip said in a low voice. "Tucker told us to pull out, but we won't go far. We'll come back tonight, and we'll all get over to the Grays. If we have to, we'll hitch your team to that buckboard Abe fixed and take Gray out in it." "Those 4 men with you," she whispered. "I don't like their looks." "Neither do I," said Rip. "Not well enough for them to be behind me. I've got a hunch they're to make sure we don't come back. We'll take care of them." The moon pushed up as the 6 jogged on down the canyon, heading for the big canyon of the Night River. The 4 men following grew careless. Rip wasn't sure that they had actually been detailed to kill them, but Tucker, he was convinced, had a great deal more against them than just suspicion. Abe Perkins had no doubts whatever but that their mission had been discovered, and the men following them had orders to kill them. The big canyon of the night river was opening below, and the dull boom of the river came to their ears. The night would make a good burial place for two strangers. Bodies dumped into its sandy current would never appear again. When the trail narrowed so that they would have to ride single file, the men behind could blast Abe and Rip out of their saddles and roll their bodies into the river. To Rip, this affair had more and more of the certain air of an execution. Executions, however, could backfire. He and Abe still had their 6-shooters under their jackets, and Abe Perkins was a tough coot who could strike with the speed of a rattler. Rip muttered a few words to him as the trail began to narrow, passing into the deep shadow of a cliff wall. Behind them, the four were riding in pairs, smoking, talking. A few yards ahead, huge boulders bordered the trail. Coming to these as the trail curved a little, Rip and Abe swung quickly down, one on each side of the trail. With the move, they drew their 6-shooters, covering the riders behind them. It was simple, because the move had been entirely unexpected. "Lift your blasted paws," yelled Abe, "or we'll blow you to pieces." Rip had scrambled to the top of a boulder, from which he could see every move the four made. They were caught flat-footed. One man, who had been carrying his rifle over his saddle horn, hesitated, but only a moment, raising his hands with the rest, letting the weapon fall. While Rip kept them covered, Abe took their guns, working carefully at their backs, shucking them of rifles and 6 guns, and searching them afterward for hidden weapons. "What we doin' with them?" inquired Rip. "Make them jump in the river," snapped Abe Perkins promptly. "These birds were sent to kill us. We'll just do the same to them." "We wasn't sent to kill you," whined one of the four. "Just to see that you went to Hurley." "Don't lie to us," growled old Abe. "Tell the truth, and we'll give you a chance to live. Lie, and we'll dump you out of your saddles." "We're only doing what we're ordered," said one of the four. "We draw our pay. They got word in Hurley you was spies of the Grays, leastwise, that's what Tucker told us." "And you were to shoot us and throw us in the river?" asked Abe sternly. "Yeah," admitted the same man. "That was it. There's a big battle coming up in these canyons, and we couldn't let no spies be in so close to the ranch. Gid Coulter is bringing out more men tonight, and him and Tucker is starting a big gun cleanup of this country tomorrow." "Coulter sent out word about us?" asked Rip. "Yeah. That you wasn't horse buyers. He telegraphed out about you, and found you didn't have $10,000 to buy horses with like you claimed." "He's a smart bird, that Coulter," admitted Abe. "And now what to do with these buzzards?" Rip glanced at a log on the riverbank, a big cottonwood that had been grounded there by a flood. "That would make a good boat for these birds," he suggested. "We'll take off their boots so they won't walk back, and let them float down the river." "Putting us into the river on that log," protested one immediately. "It's plain murder. There's rapids below." "In that case, you can beach the log before you get to the rapids, and head back to the ranch barefoot. It may take you a day or so for the trip, but they won't be needing you there anyway. Meanwhile, we want Senor Tucker to think that we're floating down the river." The men had no choice but to obey. Sullenly, they took off their boots, and after a great deal of effort, managed to roll the log into the river. Then they straddled the log, and the sluggish shore current slowly took the strange boat out into the stream. They rowed fast until they neared the Cross 7 again. Lights burned in the bunkhouse besides the main house. Cautiously, they kept to the slope opposite the ranch until they were above the Carvel camp. Rip went down to find Laura sitting by the fire. "You came back," she exclaimed at the sight of him. "Those men figured to kill us, but we gave them a little boat ride in return. Sent them off down the river on a log." His arm went around her, drawing her close. We got to make tracks out of this country fast. We're not waiting for the Grays. We'll hitch your team to that old buckboard for an ambulance for Tom. We got to take Nab and Linda Stevens with us. There's horses for everybody. Do you think you could sneak up to the house and get Nab and Linda to come down here? Tell them a big war is due to break in this country. Coulter is bringing out a bunch of men tonight to start a real war. We've got to travel to Dawn Canyon, where we'll be with friends. Chapter 8. Dale Carvel had no trouble getting to the Cross 7 ranch house undetected. Lights still burned in several of the rooms, but those occupied by Linda and Nab were dark. The two were evidently asleep. Linda had not been told that the Grays were coming to take Tom away. Tom's father had been afraid that she might reveal the secret. Laura, reaching one of the windows of the suite occupied by the two women, rapped on it lightly. Someone stirred in a bed, and the nurse Nab came to the window, her gaunt figure attired in a high-necked nightgown. There's to be real war started in here tomorrow. Gid Coulter is bringing out a bunch of men from Hurley. Abe and Rip say we've got to leave, Laura explained in a whisper. Tucker sent 4 men out tonight with Abe and Rip to kill them, but they sent the 4 men down the river on a log. We're all to go to the Grays tonight, and we've got to leave at once. Tell Linda she can't stay here any longer. I'll tell her, and I'll be thanking the Lord on my knees when and if we get out of here, said the nurse. I've expected to wake up and find myself killed in my bed almost any night for a long time. Hark! Horses were riding down the canyon to the ranch, at least a dozen of them. These, Laura guessed, would be the group brought by Gid Coulter. One rider came straight to the house. The others went to the bunkhouse below. Tucker's voice came, greeting the newcomer. Acting on an impulse while Nab and Linda Stevens were getting ready, Laura went through the dark courtyard toward the lighted windows of the big hall-like room, keeping close to the shadow of the wall. The windows of the room were uncurtained. A tall, raw-boned husky with a hooked nose was entering, Tucker following. Fred Carter was already in the room. "This is an unexpected pleasure seeing you out here, Coulter," Carter said in his arrogant way. "I could do with a drink," said Coulter, and going to a cabinet, brought out a whiskey decanter and a glass and poured liquor. Then, throwing the drink down his throat, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Carter, you've been botching up things out here," he said deliberately. "I told you not to deal with those 2 men that said they wanted to buy horses. They didn't come here for horses. Someone had them come in here, we don't know who. Whoever it was paid that $1,000 just to get that pair to the ranch. Tucker has had them taken care of, but it could have been serious. You don't seem to realize you're not really running the ranch, Carter." "No," sneered Carter. "As administrator of the Stevens estate, I control most of the common stock of the Cross 7 Company, in addition to the stock I own personally." "Stock?" Coulter laughed. "Just a lot of paper." He poured himself another drink. "You're a slick one, Carter." It was a slick idea, making people think Addison Stevens had gone crazy before he was killed, and arranging it to get the daughter declared crazy legally, and meanwhile trying to drive her crazy. You figured it would be easy to prove Hamlin Stevens insane, and with the girl and uncle declared loco by a court, you'd have the same as sole ownership of the whole ranch. Carter shrugged. "No trick to it. Everyone knows about Hamlin, and it's been my opinion that Linda is not mentally responsible. We now have the evidence to show it in court. Mrs. McNabb, a graduate nurse, will testify that the girl is not responsible." "A wonderful scheme," remarked Coulter. "But it's got one bad flaw. You've been fool enough to overlook one thing." Carter stiffened. "I don't like your talk, Gid." The saloon man gambler shrugged. You'll have to learn to like it. I'm taking charge here tonight. Tucker and the others will be taking my orders, not yours." Laura Carvel, crouched outside the open window, was watching and listening so intently that she almost forgot to breathe. It was like a scene from a play, but no play could ever be a tenth as dramatic. To her, it seemed that Coulter was playing with the hapless Carter, as the proverbial cat with its proverbial mouse. "Tucker," said Carter, "see that this fellow leaves the ranch and doesn't come back." Tucker was humorless. There was not the ghost of a grin on his face. He merely remained grimly silent. Gid Coulter, however, grinned wolfishly, and Carter realized suddenly what he was up against, that Tucker was Coulter's man, and that the other men on the ranch would take Tucker's orders. "I see," he said. "There seems nothing for me to do but to leave you in charge and have you thrown out in the courts. That won't be difficult. I can get friends to advance me enough to pay off the money you loaned to the ranch." Coulter's grin widened. "Courts, is it? We're in a canyon of the river night. A long ways from a court, Carter. I hand it to you. You've been playing a slick game to get this ranch by shutting up your relatives for insanity and at the same time driving out your neighbors. You're a good enough horseman to know the ranch is $1 million proposition here, that the horses running on the range could bring in a couple $100,000 cash sold to the right parties. A slick game, Carter, but you're licked." "We'll see," declared Carter confidently. "You can't scare me. If anything happens to me here, there'd be an inquiry that would send you to the gallows. I've got friends behind me. My wife would see to it that they'd send in a bunch of detectives." "Would they now?" asked Coulter and chuckled. "Detectives wouldn't get far in this country. I'm not trying to scare you. I'm just making an offer. I've got a few papers that either you sign or you don't leave here alive." He brought out a long, heavy envelope from his pocket. "I'll be damned if I sign anything," snarled Carter. "You can't bluff me." "In signing these papers," said Coulter, "you admit to being responsible for the killing of a few men, including Addison Stevens. You admit also to having made it look as if Addison Stevens got in a fight with one of the Grays and Neals, when they were really killed separately by your hired gunmen, and the bodies arranged so it would be laid to a gun battle. And you admit that you started a war of extermination against your neighbors." "I'm damned if I sign any such thing," burst out Carter. "You'll be damned if you don't," Coulter said, his 6-gun slithering up out of its holster. "The Night River has covered up a lot of bodies in its time. It's big enough to cover yours, too." "You can't shoot a man in cold blood, Coulter," protested Carter. "You're not as low as that." Coulter's smile only widened, and Carter turned to Tucker, standing watching quietly. "Tucker, you won't let him do it," Carter appealed to his employee. "You wouldn't see me shot down in cold blood. You're my friend, Tucker." Tucker said nothing. He merely looked at Carter, and reading that look, Carter knew he had no chance. "I'll sign," he said slowly. "I'd have more chance against a pair of rattlers." Coulter spread the contents of the envelope on a table. "Blackmail," muttered Carter, after he had scratched his name on the bottom of the pages, and Coulter had folded them up and replaced them in the envelope. "Blackmail, yes," Coulter admitted. "You'll tell the court you signed under duress, of course. But you're thinking wrong there, Carter." Something about Coulter's tone made Carter turn pale. "You mean you're going to kill me anyway?" he asked hoarsely. "It's the safest way for us, isn't it?" said Coulter. "You've always realized it yourself. Dead men tell no tales. You've been getting up an army of men to go over and wipe out the Grays and Neals and McWhirters. You'll be glad to know that's going as you planned it. I brought some more men to help, and you'll be in the saddle here as far as anyone knows. When it's over, you'll be found dead, and people will say it served you right." while the Cross 7 you hope to own for yourself will be owned by somebody else. They'll even say you killed your girl cousin when she's found dead, as she's going to be. You'll be charged with everything. And meanwhile, who will take over the ranch? Who do you think, Carter? You, said Carter. Who else? Wrong. It won't be me. It'll be a smarter man than I am. You're looking at him, Carter. Carter looked at Tucker, and then back at Coulter. Then he stared hard toward the doorway leading into the dining room. He stood as if transfixed, looking into the other room, as if he saw a ghost there. Don't let him do it, he stammered. Don't let him. The rest of his words were drowned in the loud crash of a rifle from beyond that doorway, fired by someone that Laura could not see. Carter went down all at once, his body collapsing to hit the floor with a thump. Silence followed, until Coulter chuckled. Dead center, he said. Good shooting. That mysterious murder, the shot fired through the doorway by some unknown, saved Laura Cambell from an outcry that would surely have betrayed her. An ordinary murder would have brought a scream from her, but this sinister, deliberate killing paralyzed her. Her eyes were fixed on the rectangle of the doorway, but no one appeared in it. Only after a few moments was she able to move at all. Then, horror-struck, she hurried back to the window where Linda and Nab were waiting in darkness. They helped her into the room, where she still trembled violently. Then, getting control of herself, she told them briefly what had happened. Tucker had come into the court. You heard that shot, he called. Of course I heard it, said Nab tartly. It was like a cannon. How could I help but hear it? I'll tell you about it in the morning, he said. Don't worry. Someone just accidentally discharged a gun. Tell you all about it in the morning, he added reassuringly. They waited a few minutes, then, slipping out of a back window, they left the house. A light was shining in Hamlin Stevens' quarters. Through the uncurtained windows, they saw Linda's uncle sitting at a table which had an array of bottles on it. He shouldn't be left here, said Linda. At least we could give him warning. That hog, muttered Nab. He's so worthless that no one would trouble to kill him. He's too drunk to heed any warning anyway. They hurried on into a little orchard above the ranch and went through it before dropping into the main canyon. When they were clear of the house, Laura Cambell told them more in detail what she had seen and heard, the threats of Coulter, and the shot from the unseen assassin. Abe had the Gray Cambell team hitched to the buckboard up the canyon. Rip and Clayton Gray used the stretcher to carry the helpless Tom Gray to the rig. The saddle horses had been brought there. The three women swung into the saddles, and they started off, Clayton Gray driving the rig slowly, with Abe and Rip acting as guard, one up ahead, one at the back. There was always a chance of running into some rider. From the bunkhouse came an occasional yell. The men coming out with Coulter must have brought out a supply of whiskey. The buckboard wheels ground on the rocky trail, despite the slow pace Gray used in driving, but they were far enough away so the noise could not be heard at the Cross 7. Laura's heart lightened a little with each rod of trail they covered. Reaching the side canyon that climbed to the rim, Gray pushed the team into a trot on the easier grades. Their luck had held so far, but they guessed it had deserted them when, as they neared the rim, out of Dusk Canyon welled a tremendous clatter of hoofs and loud-pitched yells. They stopped. If their flight had not been discovered, the cavalcade might continue along Dusk Canyon. Or if the riders turned up the side canyon, the fugitives could push into the brush to hide. That hope died as the riders halted at the forks of the trail. Matches flared. The rider group was looking for tracks. Plainly, they were following the buckboard. Maybe the absence of the women at the house had been noticed. At any rate, the flight had been discovered, and they were being pursued with every available Cross 7 rider. Chapter 9. It was a crazy, wild flight, with the buckboard rattling over the rocky trail, as Tom Gray's father urged the team to elope. The three women, Laura, Linda, and Nab, were keeping close behind the rig. Dusk Canyon was a deep well of shadow below, but the moon shone full on the trail, making it into a road paved with silver. A road to death, thought Rip Cambell, as he and Abe checked their horses to drop behind the buckboard. Steadily the hoofs of the small army were hammering up the side canyon, until Rip and Abe could catch fleeting glimpses of the horsemen. Some distance below the rim, the two calmly dismounted, tied their horses, and then hurried back down the trail, to halt on a narrow ledge where the road lay with a deep canyon on one side and a cliff on the other. The hoofs, thudding nearer, became a rumble that resounded in the canyon like the steady roll of thunder. Then the leaders streaked around a bend and came in full sight. "Like shootin' ducks off a pond," murmured Abe Perkins, crouching with his rifle barrel resting on a boulder. "Just can't fire into them without givin' them a little warning. Except if I knowed it was Tucker and Coulter headin' that parade. Or the feller that's bossin' all this wolf pack." They sent one warning shot, and the men pulled up at once, only to come on again, yelling savagely, sending a hot fire from their rifles. One slug tore fragments from the boulder behind which Abe Perkins was squatted. Abe swore and at once opened fire. Rip followed suit. Two men plummeted from their saddles. That was enough to halt the charge, to send the riders scattering into the brush along the trail. For a few minutes, there was a confused shouting below while the guns were still. More riders were coming up, until the side canyon seemed alive with men. Then the guns opened up almost at once, for a full minute, pouring a hail of shots up trail at the two that blocked the way. Abe and Rip sent a brisk fire in return, and the firing, echoing and re-echoing within the canyon walls, made a deafening uproar. Meanwhile, men were advancing afoot. The moonlight helped Abe and Rip, enabling them to make certain targets of two men who foolishly exposed themselves. That stopped the advance, and Rip took advantage of the lull to climb cat-like up a cliff. Working his way along it, he stopped only when he was above the vanguard of attackers. When the group moved forward again, Rip's rifle opened up at a short range. A man went down, rolling out into the trail, clawing at his chest, screeching with pain. Bullets hammered vengefully all about Rip. He was forced to flatten out until the storm of bullets ended. Soon after, he rejoined Abe. Coulter and Tucker had learned a lesson, and cagily they sent men in a wide circle that would take them behind the stubborn pair. That took time, and Rip and Abe used an old trick, stopping firing in the hope that the men below would think that they had retreated. The ruse worked. "They've gone, get after them," came an order in a voice Rip guessed to be Tucker's. "Get your horses and run them down." Men mounted again to ride forward, but they did not get far. The two rifles opened up again, and men flung themselves frantically from their saddles. This time, Abe and Rip did actually withdraw to their horses. Mounting, they rode quietly on up to the rimrock to halt again. Fearing that they would run into another trap, the group below was slow to follow, waiting for long minutes before advancing warily as if they were crossing a mined battlefield. On the rim, to Rip's and Abe's astonishment, Laura Carvel met them. "That place where Dad and I couldn't get our wagon across," she told them rather incoherently. "We got the buckboard over it. Carried Tom Gray across, and then dragged the buckboard with the help of our saddle horses. They're traveling on. Don't stay too long to fight them here. Two of you can't hope to hold them." "We done a good job of it so far," bragged Abe Perkins. "You ride on, young'un. Bullets don't know if it's a girl or man they're hitting. Get," he ordered sternly, "and keep pounding along the trail. Before long, you ought to be running into them Grays headed over this way to fetch Tom." The girl obeyed reluctantly, riding on, while Abe and Rip followed at a more leisurely pace, with ears cocked alertly for sounds along the back trail. They had traveled a mile or more before they heard the faint click of hoofs behind them again. Abe Perkins, leading the way, set a faster pace. On the open mesa, there was no chance of holding back even a dozen men, but where the road dipped into one of the big canyons running into the night, they could make another stand. The buckboard, they judged, would need a lot of time to climb up out of that canyon and go across the mesa above Dawn Canyon. As he rode, Rip was thinking of the trail ahead. It would be a race to reach Clayton Gray's ranch, but getting there meant no safety. Coulter and Tucker had enough men to force a way through the fence blocking the gorge, or, failing that, to make a wide circle to drop in on the ranch, wiping out the defenders of the Gray Ranch house. They could ride on to the other ranches in Dawn and Star Canyons, staging a massacre at each place. That outfit of killers had to be stopped. The problem was how. Considering possible ways, Rip thought of Gray Gorge, that narrow deep trench closed in by sheer rock cliffs which a chipmunk could not climb. He had thought on his ride through the gorge that it would make a wonderful natural trap for wild horses. In a way, this chase was like many of the chases he had made to capture bands of mustangs. Only in this chase, he was running with the hunted, chased by a wolf pack that would tear them to pieces. As the mesa began to dip toward the canyon, they heard a sudden clatter of hoofs from horsemen ahead of them. Abe Perkins checked his mount. "They sure ain't circled and got ahead of us," he growled. "No, you knothead," returned Rip and spurred his horse. "It's the Grays coming over for Tom." 4 riders emerged from the trees and swept toward them, only to turn to ride along with the pair. They could not afford to stop. The hammer of hoofs was growing louder behind them. Of the 4 riders, 2 were Laura Carvel and Clayton Gray. Dr. Will Gray had been in the rescue party and had taken Clayton's place in the buckboard with his nephew. The other 2 riders were Tom's brothers, Ed and Lee. They now had 5 men to hold back pursuit, but even 5 were too few to hold back the little army long. "We can make it to the ranch all right," shouted Clayton to Rip, riding alongside. "What happens after is what worries me. There's only 8 families of us living in Dawn and Star. A 15-year-old wild boy came along with us to help fetch Tom. When we met your rig, we sent him hightailing it ahead to get all the folks in the canyons to come to my ranch to meet this gun outfit. All we can do is to hole up and fight them off until outside help comes, which will take a day or so, if any help comes at all." "Maybe we can do better than hold them off," Rip returned. "I've trapped more than a few bands of wild horses in my life." "So have I," returned Clayton over the drum of hoofs. "Drove them into natural corrals or pens we built. But what's trapping mustangs got to do with this flock of buzzards?" "Just this," explained Rip. "You've got a natural horse trap in that gorge, and with both ends of it closed, you'd have a corral strong enough to hold men. You've got the lower end of it closed by that fence at your ranch. If you had the upper end blocked, this Coulter-Tucker bunch would be trapped. The upper end is only a few yards across, and I noticed a pile of barbed wire rolls there. Yeah, we intended to make a fence there to keep our horses from drifting over on the Cross 7 range. That same wire strung across the gorge, and helped by a few riflemen, could keep a big bunch of men penned in. You haven't got enough men to fight this bunch a battle on even terms, but I figure there's enough of us to keep them penned in that gorge, both day and night, as long as the moon is as bright as it is now." Clayton Gray silently chewed over the proposition as they dropped into the depths of the canyon. He was still considering it when they climbed out. They had gained on the buckboard, with Linda and Nab still riding close behind it. The rig would need time to travel the steep trenches and switchbacks by which the road descended into Dawn Canyon and Gray Gorge. It was time to make another stand. The 4 men, with Laura still stubbornly staying with them, halted on the canyon rim, dismounting to take cover. Once more the pursuing cavalcade thudded up, to meet a hail of shots and to scatter before it. And again, Coulter and Tucker sent men in a circle. On the rim, the 5 fanned out to meet this maneuver, spreading out to keep the circlers from getting past them. For fully 10 minutes there was a hot exchange of shots. Then the men and Laura Carvel raced on. It was only then that Clayton Gray gave his judgment on Rip's plan. "That scheme of yours," he said, "is all right. With both ends of the gorge closed, we'd have a fair chance of holding him there. A monkey couldn't climb those walls. There's just one break in them that men could use to get up out of there afoot, but we can watch that spot. We'll try it. I'll stay behind with my boys to put up that fence and build us a barricade. The upper stretch of the gorge is as bare as an egg, no cover at all for men to crawl along it." "Better let me stay in your place," volunteered Rip. "You know your neighbors. You go on and get them organized to hold that fence. That's where these snakebloods will try hardest to break through." Gray nodded. "All right. We'll hold them below. There ought to be 5 or 6 men and older boys down there by now, with more coming." Near the upper end of the gorge, they met 2 of the Gray neighbors, men from the McWhirter family who had come to help get Tom Gray back from the Cross 7. These 2 volunteered to stay with Rip and Lee, and Ed Gray to block the upper end of the gorge. Laura and Clayton Gray rode on, leaving the 5 men who tied their horses back of some huge boulders and waited. 5 minutes later, the first of the Cross 7 riders came by, and then the main body, a flowing river of horsemen in the moonlight, pouring into the shadows of the gorge walls. The 5 waited until the last straggling riders had gone. Then they set to work, hastily unrolling the spools of wire, fastening the strands to trees and jagged pinnacles of rock, erecting a barricade with dangling loops of wire that made a barbed tangle of metal snakes across the head of the gorge. Then they built boulders into a wall on a little shelf some 20 feet above the gorge floor. This was to serve as a barricade behind which riflemen could crouch to cover the stretch behind the wire trap. By then, at the other end of the short gorge, the firing had started, hot and heavy. Coulter and Tucker were evidently attacking the high fence below the Gray house. Rip was anticipating that Tucker and Coulter would try their old tactics if they met too strong opposition, send part of their force back through the gorge to circle along the rims and jump the Gray ranch on a flank. 15 minutes later, the thud of hoofs sounded along the gorge, and half a dozen riders came in sight, racing unsuspectingly toward the wire barrier. Rip and the others behind the stone barricade on the shelf held their fire until the riders swept into a moonlit stretch. When their rifles boomed, it was plain slaughter. 2 men were instantly dumped from their saddles. The rest frantically scurried back, leaving the fallen men where they lay. It was plain that 3 men were easily adequate to hold this end of the gorge. Judging by the heavy firing, help might be needed at the other end. Lee Gray and Rip left afoot, climbing to the rim of the gorge and traveling along it until they were above the Gray ranch. The guns were still making a harsh, bellowing bedlam of sound below. So far, at least, the attackers had been unable to penetrate the high fence across the gorge. Rip's black and tan hound, which he had left at the Gray ranch when he had taken Dale Carvel there, came from the ranch house to greet his master with his usual single deep bark. Stopping at the house, Rip found Laura, Nab, and 2 neighbor women of the Grays preparing a hot meal for the fighters. Dale Carvel was in bed, demanding querulously that, broken leg or no broken leg, he be carried to a place where he could help in the battle. Tom Gray was in another room, with Linda Stevens attending him. There was no time to stop at the house, however. The guns were raising a fresh uproar below. Rip hurried down to join in the defense of the ranch. Chapter 10. Rip found Abe Perkins, Clayton Gray, and 2 neighbors firing from behind a wall of stones loopholed for their rifles, and looking down on the high wire fence in the gorge bottom. Other riflemen were located behind barricades on the slope. The moon and stars were fading fast before the slowly approaching day, and as Rip arrived, the Tucker-Coulter men were making use of the faint light to try and advance. It was a cautious one, however, with men keeping under close cover as they moved forward in an attempt to reach the fence. Fully half of the force stayed behind to hail shots at the rifle barricades on the slope. Coolly, calmly, deliberately, the Grays and their neighbors fired whenever a target presented itself. Before that slow, deadly shooting, the advance was stopped cold. Coulter and Tucker withdrew their men to some boulders in the gorge bottom, and the guns fell silent. "We got a bear by the tail," remarked Abe Perkins as he reloaded his rifle. "It's like having a bunch of hornets in your back pocket. As long as you keep them buttoned tight in there, you're safe." Clayton Gray nodded. "We'll keep them there. Besides the two ends of that gorge, there's only one way of getting out, by a sort of chimney worn by floodwater. They may find that chimney when it comes full day and crawl up it. We'll have to be waiting for them." He grinned at Rip suddenly. "Your man-traps worked fine so far. Lee just told me you didn't have much trouble at the other end." Rip chuckled grimly. "No, it was the other bunch that had all the trouble." Dr. Will Gray, a cigar stuck jauntily in his mouth and lugging a long-barreled rifle, crawled over to join them. "Enough men down there to burn us all out if they ever get loose," he remarked. "I just can't believe what I'm seeing and hearing. Laura Carvel says they killed Fred Carter, intending to put the blame for this whole ruckus on him. And she said Coulter admitted he wasn't boss of all this, that the boss was the man that shot Carter from that room, only Laura didn't see who he was. Who he could be is something I can't figure out." As full day came, the shots again began buzzing up angrily. Then they suddenly stopped, and a man, after waving a rag that might be called white, showed himself. Coming closer, the flag-bearer was revealed as Gid Coulter. He marched up to the fence and halted. Clayton Gray showed himself on the slope. "What you wanting?" he called. "We'll give you one chance to get out of this with your lives," called Coulter. "Quit now, and we'll let you have a week to take your families and your stock out of these canyons. You can't lick us. You can't hold us down here. We'll find a way out." "Coulter," said Clayton, astounded by the man's brass, "on top of all else you're a fool. This country won't stand for a massacre by a red man or white. You can try to blame this on Carter, but we know Carter is dead, and you and Tucker and every one of your bunch will pay for this." "Try to collect that pay," snarled Coulter. "Nobody is going to do anything to any of us. This will go down as just a neighborhood quarrel. Are you quitting or not? It's your last chance." "Get out of my sight," raged Gray, "before I lose control of my trigger finger. We'll hunt the highest tree in the country to hang you from, along with Tucker and whoever is the big boss of your gang." Coulter retreated, and the guns started up again in a renewed fury. Some of the attackers were going along the cliff walls, hunting for a way of escape, while the Grays and their neighbors trailed them along the rim of the gorge, angling down shots whenever they saw targets. One man succeeded in climbing to a ledge that seemed to promise a route to the rim. Lee Gray discovered him and fired a wild shot. The man, however, was scared, and losing his hold, fell some 30 feet to land in a crumpled heap. The sun began to shine down with an increasing warmth that gave promise of an oven heat later in the day. Reluctantly, the Cross-7 riders were forced to realize that they were in a jam, caught in a rock-girt pen, whose two gateways were defended by stubborn riflemen. There was no hope of successfully attacking those blocking fences in daylight. Their best chance was in waiting until night, hoping that a mountain storm might come up, bringing a darkness that would enable them to cut through one of the fences. But Coulter and Tucker evidently weren't willing to wait. They seemed possessed by the fierce desire of all trapped animals for freedom. There must be some other way out, and with a cautious regard for the watching rifles, they continued to search for it, not overlooking any possible out for them. It was half an hour before one of the group discovered the chimney-like crack in a cliff wall. Climbing it, the man came to a water trough channeled in the rock and angling steeply upward. Unaware that eyes were watching from above, he returned jubilantly to report his discovery. Shortly afterward, some 10 men began crawling up the chimney, with rifles fastened to their backs. Below, the remainder of the Tucker-Coulter force had opened up a hot fire, keeping their guns booming to cover the escape of part of their crew. A hard climb brought the 10, led personally by Tucker and Coulter, to the bottom of a shallow well of rock just below the rim. The sides of this well were some 20 feet high, but slanted, so that an acrobatic man could scramble up it and assist the others to join him. As they rested for a few minutes from the climb, a pebble fell from the lip of the well and clattered at their feet. The men all glanced up nervously. "We could have made that a 50-pound boulder," called down Rip, who had been given command of the party of 6 men that had been waiting patiently. "You fellows can climb on up, but leave your guns behind you. You won't need them anymore." George Tucker stared up hard at the screen of cedars that grew on the lip of the well, trying to pierce the particular curtain from which the voice had sounded. "You're the fellow that was camped below the ranch," he said accusingly. "Damn those 4 that let you and your partner get away. If I'd only shot you down when we had you surrounded in your camp, we'd have dodged all this trouble." "All that's water passed under the bridge," Rip returned. "Are you quittin', Tucker, or not? We're sure not letting you go back. Make up your mind, and do it quick. Your outfit is too dangerous to play around with." Tucker stepped close to Coulter and muttered something to him. When Coulter shook his head, Tucker cursed him. Tucker had a certain bull-headed bravery about him, and just now a blind, unreasoning rage. "Go to hell," he bawled as an answer to the invitation to surrender, and swung up his rifle to begin pulling the trigger, shooting blindly at the cedar screen. The first shot threw the rest of the men into confusion. Most of them jumped away as far as possible from Tucker, pressing their bodies against the sides of the deep cup in which they had been trapped. As they jumped, they yelled that they quit. Coulter and 1 other man turned to try to slip back down the way they had come, hoping to escape. From above, the guns boomed a heavy echo to Tucker's shots. Tucker went down, trying vainly to keep his big legs under him. Even lying on the rocky floor, he tried to raise his rifle to his shoulder to fire a last shot. But that effort was too great for him. A slug, sent by Zane Gray, had smashed through Tucker's chest. The man who had attempted to escape with Coulter had been ahead of the saloonman gambler. Taking a desperate chance, he half leapt, half slid down a small cliff, missed by the bullets raining from above. Coulter, following him frantically, was not so lucky. A rifle shot caught him in the back, sent him sprawling. With that, the battle was over almost as soon as it had begun. The rest of the men in the rock cup, with their rifles dropped, were still screeching that they quit, and keeping their hands raised high as proof that they meant what they yelled. They were ordered to climb from the hole, leaving Tucker and Coulter. Rip and Abe Perkins descended to look at the pair. Abe turned Tucker over with a foot for an examination. "Dead as a petrified Injun maid," he announced. "And I'm hoppin' the same for Mr. Coulter." Abe was doomed to disappointment on that point. Coulter was still alive, but able to do no more than glare up at Abe. Likely to have to waste a lot of good whiskey and grub trying to keep him alive until they can hang him, Abe said sourly. Lariats had been brought, and one of them now was used to lift Coulter from the hole. Then, with 2 of the other prisoners carrying the wounded Coulter, Rip and Abe started back toward the Gray Ranch, threading a course above the cliffs. Zane Gray was left to guard against any attempt at further escape by way of the watercourse. When the party reached the ranch, they found that the guns of the men trapped in the gorge were still. The one man who had slid back safely had returned to his companions to tell them of the disaster that had met Coulter, Tucker, and the others. Everything had been staked on the hope that the Tucker-Coulter group would be able to surprise the ranchers from the rear. With that hope gone and their two leaders missing, they had no resistance left. Hungry and disheartened, they asked for a parley. A little later, they marched out with their hands up. They were herded with the other prisoners into a little natural rock pen where they were given food and held under guard. By this time, nearly the whole population of Dawn and Star Canyons had arrived at the Gray Ranch. A few men argued hotly for a wholesale hanging of the Cross 7 gunmen, but cooler counsel prevailed. Some of the men working for the Cross 7 might have been persuaded that they were fighting on the righteous side of a range war. Their punishment was for the courts to decide. As for two of the ringleaders, Tucker was dead, and Dr. Gray gave Coulter but a few hours to live. A committee of 3 men was chosen to ride to Hurley, to notify not only the sheriff, a close Coulter friend, but in addition, a score of leading citizens who would be asked to come out to thresh over the Battle of Gray Gorge and the events leading up to it. Meanwhile, the ranchers of Dawn and Star Canyons were quietly jubilant. They had lost no men in the battle in the gorge. Young Tom Gray, for the first time since he had been carried to Laura Carvel's camp, was pronounced out of danger by his uncle. Dale Carvel's broken leg needed only time to mend. Rip Cambell and Abe Perkins had headed for the kitchen, with the satisfaction that the job which had brought them to help Linda Stevens was done. She had escaped the dangers which Nab had rightly feared threatened the girl. The kitchen was crowded with strange women, which was all right with Abe Perkins. He barged right up to the stove, grabbing an empty plate on the way. Rip, however, hesitated in the doorway, and Laura Carvel, knowing what he had come for, filled a plate with the old ranch standby's beef and beans and brought it to him. Then, while he ate on a bench outdoors, she sat beside him. "All over," he remarked cheerfully. "And they raise mighty good-tasting beef in this country. Raise almost as good cattle, I guess, as they do horses." "Can't you forget horses?" Laura said, teasingly. He put down his plate and laid his hand on hers. "It's a good idea to try to forget things like those that happened last night, Laura. I'd rather remember the campfires I saw in here, and seeing you by their light. I'd like to see you beside a lot of campfires in these canyons, Laura. What's happened in here was horrible, but it wasn't the fault of the canyons, just the wrong sort of people. I like this country. I'd like to stay in it. Clayton, Gray, and the doctor have talked to me about taking over the job of gathering their horses and selling them. I've got a better job for you than that. Linda told me that she'd like to have you take over the job of running the Cross 7. You and Tom Gray. Linda's certain now that her father was never insane, and she's not afraid to marry Tom. It could be worked out. To work for the Cross 7, I guess," admitted Rip. "I'm kind of thinking that my partner will want to be over here near Nab. We could sell our ranch for enough to buy an interest in the Cross 7. But I'd do that only if you stayed here, too, with me. Will you, Laura?" "I'll stay wherever you are," she said simply. "But Rip, there's something that still bothers me." The rest seem to have forgotten it, but we still don't know who shot Fred Carter through that doorway. We don't know who engineered all this, working through Coulter and Tucker, she went on impetuously. Some man planned to have Linda killed. And no one knows who he is. He might still be making plans. "You're right on that," he agreed soberly. "Doc Gray has been trying to get it out of Coulter, but so far it's no go." He turned to look at the door of the lean, to where the wounded Coulter had been taken. The door opened suddenly, and Dr. Gray stepped out. His face was flushed with anger as he turned toward the open doorway. "It's the least that you could do to make up a little for all the hell you fellows caused in here," he shouted. "We'll find out sooner or later who was behind all this. You might as well tell us now. Who was it that shot Fred Carter?" "I shot him," said Coulter promptly from the bed where he lay. It was a pleasure to see him kick. And there wasn't nobody running this show, except me and Tucker. We was only using Carter, cashing in on the dirty scheme he had in his head, getting Addison Stevens killed and starting a range war in here. Me and Tucker, we'd have got the ranch through the loan I had made the Cross 7. It would have been easy with Linda and that drunk fool of a Hamlin dead. I'd have hated to kill Hamlin, though. He's the best drinking customer I ever had, Hamlin was. Hamlin was what? Croaked someone behind Laura and Rip. They both turned. Hamlin Stevens was sitting on a sorrel horse 10 feet from them. He was clad in a leather jacket, old wool shirt, soiled corduroy breeches, and a pair of badly scuffed English riding boots. The frog-like eyes in his sharp-featured face seemed to bulge out further than ever. He chuckled as the doctor stared at him, astonished. "What's been going on over here, Doc?" he called. "A worse nightmare than you ever had after your sprees," the doctor responded shortly. "You can count yourself lucky you're still alive, Hamlin. They were about to wipe out your whole family to get the Cross 7. You probably know that Fred Carter was killed last night. Or don't you?" Hamlin shrugged. "The China cook told me," he said. "And not much loss if we had been wiped out. These canyons of the night have been bad luck for all of us Stevenses." Beside Rip, Laura drew in a sharp breath, and her fingers were suddenly digging hard into his arm as she half arose. Rip, looking up, was astonished to find her pretty face drawn and pale, her dark eyes staring wide at the rider on the sorrel. "Why, what's the matter, Laura?" he asked. "There," she exclaimed in a half-strangled voice. "There." She lifted her hand and pointed at Hamlin Stevens. "He is the one that killed Fred Carter. He was the man that shot Carter through the doorway." Both Rip and Dr. Will Gray stared bewilderedly at the girl. "You don't believe me, but I say he killed Fred Carter." "I know it. I just feel it," she went on, almost hysterically. "He was the one that would have gotten the Cross 7 with his relatives all dead. He may be insane, but he was smart enough to plan all this. And he'll still go on killing and planning." Dr. Gray shook his head. "No," he said, "you're mistaken, Laura. Why, Hamlin, His voice trailed off as he looked at the rider of the sorrel. The bugged eyes of the man were staring with a horrible fixity at the girl, and with a light that never shone from a sane person's eyes. Then a chuckle came from Stevens. "She's right, Doc," he said in an amused voice. "She's guessed it. She's a smart girl, too smart." Again Stevens chuckled, and "Look out!" shouted Dr. Gray. "He's got a gun." Laura Carvel knew that whether Hamlin Stevens was insane or not, she faced death from the ugly snout of the six-shooter that came up from under the leather jacket and swung slowly toward her. Frozen, she stood, and then a hand and arm were pushing her back over the bench, and Rip was springing in front of her. Laura could not have lifted a finger to save herself, but she screamed now, realizing that Rip was taking the bullet intended for her. The bellow of the gun was like the crack of doom in her ears. Then desperately she was scrambling to her feet. The sorrel horse was jumping about under Stevens, who was trying to level the still smoking gun to fire again, as Rip, unarmed, was running toward the man, straight into the next bullet that would come from the gun. But before that shot could be fired, a rifle, which sounded like a cannon, exploded from the direction of the kitchen. Hamlin Stevens, blood flowing from his temple, toppled from his saddle to fall a shapeless lump on the ground. Laura looked back and saw old Abe Perkins by the kitchen doorway, holding a long-barreled rifle from which powder smoke curled out lazily. Abe looked at the fallen figure of the man to make sure that he did not need another shot, and then felt of his shoulder. "By dang," Rip's partner complained. "This old blunderbuss has got the worst kick of anything I ever pulled trigger on. Ought to be a law against weapons like this here." Laura was looking unbelievingly at Rip, who had turned toward her. Plainly, he was unhurt. She ran to him shakily. "How did he ever miss you?" she asked, still unable to believe the miracle. "He wasn't 10 feet away when he shot." "Why, honey," he told her as his arms folded about her, "that was plumb simple. I just shied my empty plate at his horse's head. And the sorrel nag jumped so far, Hamlin couldn't have hit the side of a barn if he'd been shooting from inside it." "He might have killed you," sobbed Laura. "Look," he went on gently, "I told you what has happened in here we'll forget. It's looking ahead that we'll be doing from now on, to all the campfires we'll have under the stars. And to that big log house with 20 or 30 rooms I'm going to build for you in one of these canyons of the river night." She smiled then, her dark eyes shining. "Yes, Rip. We'll look ahead," she promised. The end.